In 1774, a Scottish farmer living in the windswept hills of the Scottish northeast broke open a stone-sealed mound that had sat undisturbed for over 1,000 years. What he found inside did not fit any known category of history. It did not match any burial tradition anyone could verify. It did not follow the rules of what archaeologists, historians, and scholars believed about the ancient people who once covered Scotland in symbols no one has ever fully decoded. What he found raised questions that are still being asked today, and in some corners of the academic world, quietly avoided. This is not a story about treasure in the gold and jewels sense. This is something stranger. A story about a civilization so old, so stubbornly mysterious, that even after 2 centuries of excavation, analysis, carbon dating, and linguistic study, we still cannot read their writing. We still cannot agree on where they came from. We still cannot explain certain objects found inside their mounds that seem to belong to a world that should not have existed in northern Scotland in the first millennium of the Common Era. And in 1774, a farmer with a spade and no idea what he was doing cracked open a door that had been sealed for centuries, and what spilled out of that mound was not just artifacts. It was a question so large that it is still echoing. Tonight, we go into the mound with him. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. There is no better way to drift into sleep than to follow a mystery that has no clean ending, to let your mind wander through ancient stone chambers and fog-covered hills where a people once lived and carved their strange symbols into rock and then vanished, leaving almost nothing behind except those symbols and the cold silence of the earth above them. So settle in, close your eyes if you want, let the story carry you. Maybe subscribe if this kind of slow, deep journey into the hidden corners of history is what you come here for, and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. I always check the comments. Someone is always reading from a place I would never have imagined. The year is 1774. The place is somewhere in the rolling landscape of what is now Aberdeenshire, in the far northeast of Scotland. The terrain here is not soft. It is old and hard, and it carries the memory of weather in every feature of the land. The hills are low and broad, the kind of hills that look like the backs of sleeping giants. The fields in October are brown and worked, the harvest already in, the soil turned over and cooling toward winter. A farmer named James Brodie, or a man very much like him, because the historical record here is frustratingly vague, was doing what farmers in this part of Scotland had done for generations. He was clearing ground, moving stones, trying to flatten a portion of his field that had always been uneven, always slightly raised in a particular spot, a low mound that sat in the middle of good planting soil and had always been quietly in the way. He had probably walked past this mound 1,000 times. His father had walked past it, his grandfather too. Everyone in the area understood, in that wordless way that rural communities carry knowledge, that the mound was old, that it should not be disturbed. There were stories, of course. There are always stories about the mounds in Scotland, stories about what lives inside them, stories about what happens to people who break them open. The old Gaelic traditions spoke of the fairy mounds, the Scythian, the hollow hills where things older than memory lived and did not welcome visitors. In the local folklore, opening a mound uninvited was the kind of decision a person regretted, usually in very specific and unpleasant ways. But this farmer needed the ground flat. And on this particular autumn afternoon, whatever combination of practicality and courage and impatience drove him forward, he drove his spade into the side of the mound and began to dig. What he found almost immediately was stone. Not the loose, random stones of a field wall tumbled down by time, but deliberate stone, shaped stone, placed stone, the kind of stonework that could only have been done by human hands with a specific intention. He dug around it. He called for help, probably. And together they began to uncover what the mound had been hiding for somewhere between 800 and 1200 years. There was a chamber inside. A sealed chamber, roofed with flat slabs of stone laid across upright sides, the whole thing built with a care and precision that did not match anything a farmer in 1774, Aberdeenshire, would have associated with the ancient dead. This was not a grave, in any familiar sense. This was architecture. Small, yes, but deliberate, and sealed, and old, in a way that the people standing around it that afternoon could feel without being able to explain. And inside the chamber, in the dark that had not seen light since sometime around the 9th or 10th century, there were things. What exactly those things were depends on which account you read, and here is where the story begins to fracture in the way that all the best historical mysteries fracture, which is to say, right at the most important moment. The contemporary accounts are partial. The objects were handled without any sense of archaeological protocol, because archaeological protocol as a formal discipline would not exist for another century. Some things were kept, some were probably lost. Some were described in letters and local papers in ways that were sensationalized or misremembered or filtered through the particular anxieties and assumptions of the late 18th century. But certain things are agreed upon. Certain things appear in enough separate sources, described with enough specificity to suggest they were real, and those things do not have a clean explanation. We will get to them, but to understand why they matter, you first need to understand the people who built that mound, because the Picts are one of the most extraordinary puzzles in all of European prehistory. And the more you know about them, the stranger the 1774 discovery becomes. The word Pict appears for the first time in a Roman document from 297 AD. A speech by a Roman orator named Eumenius, delivered in Gaul, contains a passing reference to Picti and Hiberni attacking a Roman province in Britain. That is the first written record we have of anyone using this name. Picti, the painted ones or the tattooed ones, depending on which Latin etymology you prefer. The Romans saw them and gave them a name that focused on what they looked like rather than what they called themselves. Because here is the first deep mystery of the Picts. We do not know what they called themselves. The name Pict was a Roman label, possibly a nickname, possibly a description, possibly even a slur. The people living north of the Roman frontier in what is now Scotland may or may not have recognized it as a name for themselves. They may have had an entirely different word for their own identity, spoken in a language that has left us almost nothing to work with, and which has not been successfully decoded despite centuries of effort. This is not an exaggeration for dramatic effect. The Pictish language is genuinely, stubbornly, frustratingly undeciphered. There are approximately 30 inscriptions in what appears to be the Pictish language, using an alphabet called the Ogham script that was also used by early Irish and Welsh writers. But the inscriptions in Ogham from Ireland and Wales can be read, because we can trace those languages. The Pictish Ogham inscriptions cannot be read in the same way. The words do not resolve into anything recognizable. Scholars have proposed that Pictish was a Celtic language, a pre-Indo-European language, a language related to the extinct P-Celtic branch spoken across early Britain, and a language that simply has not left us enough material to decode. None of these proposals has achieved consensus. The language remains sealed, the same way that Farmer's Mound was sealed, giving you just enough to know something is inside without letting you read what it says. The Picts were not newcomers to Scotland. The genetic and archaeological evidence suggests they were the descendants of people who had lived in northern Scotland for thousands of years, possibly stretching back to the Neolithic period when the great stone monuments of Scotland were being built. They were not Celts who arrived in a migration. They were already there when the Celts arrived. They were already there when the Romans came north and decided that conquering northern Scotland was more trouble than it was worth, which is itself a remarkable statement, given that the Romans conquered almost everything else they decided to take seriously. The Roman Emperor Hadrian built his wall in 122 AD, not because he could not defeat the people north of it, but because the calculation of what it would cost to hold that land against those people was unfavorable. The people the Romans eventually called Picts defeated every serious Roman attempt to push north of what is now the Scottish lowlands. They fought the Romans to a standstill, and then when the Romans left Britain, they expanded south and settled into the vacuum. This is a people who fought Rome and won, who lived in the far north of Britain and built a sophisticated culture that lasted for centuries, who carved elaborate, beautiful, intricate symbols onto standing stones, onto silver, onto bone, onto the walls of caves, and who left no explanation of what any of those symbols mean. The symbol stones of the Picts are one of the most haunting artistic legacies in all of European history. They stand in fields and churchyards across the northeast of Scotland. They have been standing there for over 1,000 years. Some were carved as early as the 6th century, some as late as the 9th. They show animals drawn with a realism and confidence that is genuinely breathtaking. A swimming elephant seal rendered with anatomical precision, a wolf turning its head with an expression of alert intelligence, An eagle clutching a fish with the particular body language of a bird that has done exactly this 10,000 times and knows it perfectly. The Picts were extraordinary artists. But interspersed with these naturalistic animals are the symbols, the abstract designs that appear on Pictish stones again and again, always in the same combinations, always rendered with the same precision. A crescent and V-rod, a double disc and Z-rod, a rectangle divided into sections, a mirror, a comb. These symbols appear on stones from one end of Pictish territory to the other. They appear on silver plaques. They appear on bone pins. They appear scratched into cave walls. They were clearly meaningful, clearly important, clearly part of a coherent symbolic system, and we have absolutely no idea what they mean. A crescent and V-rod appears on roughly 200 Pictish stones. It is one of the most common symbols in the entire Pictish repertoire, and no one, in the entire history of scholarship on the Picts, has produced an explanation of what it means that has achieved anything close to universal agreement. There are theories, there are always theories, but the symbol itself remains sealed. This is the people whose mound was opened in 1774, a people who were sophisticated, formidable in war, artistically extraordinary, culturally complex, and almost entirely self-sealed from our understanding. A people who were absorbed, slowly and then all at once, into the Gaelic and Norse and Anglo-Saxon world of early medieval Britain, leaving behind their stones and their silver and their symbols and almost nothing else. Their language vanished. Their royal lineages were absorbed into Scottish kingship and renamed. Their symbol system stopped being used around the 9th century, for reasons that are debated but not agreed upon. And then the mounds sat in the fields of Aberdeenshire for 1,000 years, and the stories accumulated around them, and farmers walked past them and told their children not to dig. Until 1774, when one of them did. To understand what made the discovery so strange, you need to understand what archaeologists and historians expected to find in a Pictish burial mound. And to understand that, you need to understand what we knew, and what we still know, about how the Picts treated their dead. The honest answer is that we do not know very much, and that itself is part of the mystery. For a culture that lasted several centuries, that controlled a significant portion of northern Britain, that clearly had the resources and organization to commission and carve elaborate symbol stones, the Picts left surprisingly few burials that can be identified with confidence. There are cemeteries, there are scattered burials, but nothing like the rich, well-documented burial tradition of, say, the Anglo-Saxons to the south, who buried their kings and nobles with ships and gold and weapons and whole suites of objects that tell you immediately something about who the person was and what they believed about the world after death. Pictish burials are typically sparse. A body, often placed in a stone-lined grave called a cist. Sometimes a few personal objects, sometimes grave goods, sometimes nothing at all. The high-status Pictish burials that have been found are notably understated compared to contemporary cultures elsewhere in Britain and Europe. This is interesting for several reasons. It might reflect a belief system that did not place heavy emphasis on equipping the dead for another journey. It might reflect a Christianity that was adopted earlier and more completely in Pictland than we assume, suppressing older burial practices. It might reflect something about Pictish social organization that we have not correctly understood. Or it might reflect the fact that the really important Pictish burials, the ones with the most significant objects, have not been found yet, or were found, and not properly recorded. The 1,774 mound does not fit the pattern of the sparse cist burial. It is too elaborate, the chamber is too substantial, and the objects inside, according to the accounts that survive, are wrong in ways that are difficult to explain. The first account of the discovery comes from a letter written sometime in the 1770s by a local minister, the kind of educated man who, in 18th century rural Scotland, was often the conduit between local events and the wider world of scholarship. He describes visiting the site after the opening, speaking with the farmer who had done the digging, and examining what had been found. His description is careful in some places and maddeningly vague in others. He confirms the stone chamber. He confirms that it had been sealed with a large, flat slab placed horizontally across the top, which had been intact until the farmer removed it. He notes that the interior of the chamber was dry, which he found remarkable given the Scottish climate, and attributes it to the quality of the stonework. He mentions that the chamber contained what he describes as a quantity of bones, though he is uncertain whether they are human, and notes that they were too fragile to be moved without crumbling. And then he describes the other objects. There were carved stones, small ones, not the standing monument variety, but portable stones, roughly the size of a hand, on which symbols had been incised. He describes what sounds like a mirror symbol and a crescent symbol, both of which are well-documented Pictish designs. This part of the account is consistent with what we know about the Picts. But then he describes something else, something he has difficulty categorizing. He writes of a piece of worked metal, clearly not iron, which he takes to be bronze, though he admits the color is unusual. The piece is described as a plate, roughly rectangular, with a design on it that he cannot fully interpret, but which he describes as showing figures in a pattern that seems to tell a story, though he cannot identify what story. He compares it briefly, and somewhat apologetically, to images he has seen in books about the decorative traditions of other ancient peoples, and then quickly moves on. He also mentions, and this is where things get genuinely complicated, what he describes as a small vessel made of a clay or ceramic material that he has not seen before, which was intact when found, but which broke apart over the following days, possibly due to exposure to air after centuries of being sealed. This vessel, he says, contained a dark residue that had the smell of something organic, though he cannot specify further. These objects are not what you expect to find in a Pictish burial, not because the Picts were incapable of making bronze plaques with figured designs, but because those kinds of objects, with that kind of iconography, in that kind of burial context, pointing toward a tradition that is more elaborate and more iconographically complex than the typical Pictish grave good, raise questions about what exactly was being placed in this chamber and why. The minister's letter was read by a few people in Edinburgh's scholarly circles. It generated some interest. And then the War of American Independence happened, and the world's attention moved elsewhere, and the mound in Aberdeenshire faded from general notice. But other accounts followed, and they are where things get really interesting. The second account comes from a man named Thomas Cordiner, who was a traveller and amateur antiquarian who toured Scotland in the 1770s and 1780s, and wrote up his observations in a series of letters that were eventually published. Cordiner was not present at the opening of the mound, but he visited the area a few years later and spoke with people who had been there, and he examined what remained of the objects that had been found. His account is both more detailed and more troubling than the minister's letter. Cordiner confirms the chamber, the bones, the carved stones with Pictish symbols. And then he goes further. He describes in more detail the bronze or bronze-like plate that the minister mentioned, and what he says about it deserves to be quoted as closely as the historical record allows. He describes a flat plate of metal, worked with figures on one side, which he takes to be a decorative object of some kind. The figures, he says, show what appear to be human forms in postures of movement, rendered in a style that he finds difficult to place in any tradition he is familiar with. He specifically says the style does not look like Roman work, which is a meaningful statement, because Roman objects were known to appear in Scottish contexts, traded, or captured, or filtered northward through centuries of contact. He says it does not look like the decorative metalwork he has seen attributed to the early Irish tradition, which was also known and influential in early medieval Scotland. He says it looks, and he clearly finds this embarrassing to write, somewhat like figures he has seen in illustrations of non-European art, without being able to be more specific. What Cordiner is groping toward, without the vocabulary to say it directly, is that the object did not fit any tradition he had reference points for. Then he mentions a second object that the minister had not described or had not been shown. A piece of worked bone or ivory, he is not certain which, carved into a shape that he describes as a stylized animal form, but with features that he cannot match to any animal he knows. It is, he says, clearly the product of skilled craftsmanship. It is not a crude or amateur piece. But the animal it depicts, if it is an animal, is rendered in a way that is not naturalistic in the Pictish manner, not stylized in the Germanic or Celtic manner, but something he has no word for. He notes that these objects were in the possession of a local gentleman by the time he visited, and that this gentleman did not wish to have them too closely examined, which he attributes to a general proprietorial feeling about the find, but which he finds somewhat frustrating. He was allowed to look at the objects. He was not allowed to handle them extensively or to make detailed drawings, which he clearly regrets. These objects have never been publicly displayed. As far as the historical record shows, they were never submitted to any museum or scholarly institution. They pass through the hands of that local gentleman and then vanish from the record entirely. This is not unusual for the period. The late 18th century in Scotland was a time when antiquarian collecting was common, and the sense that finds of this kind had any public dimension was limited. Objects found on private land were private property, and if the owner chose to keep them in a cabinet in his library and show them to select visitors, that was entirely within his rights. Most such collections were eventually dispersed through inheritance, sale, or simple loss. Some of them ended up in museums decades later, poorly documented and stripped of their context. Some never surfaced at all. But the Aberdeenshire objects, whatever they were, left no museum trail. They left no catalogue entry. They left only these two 18th century accounts and the frustrating silence that follows them. A third account, written in the early 19th century by a local historian compiling a history of Aberdeenshire parishes, mentions the 1,774 discovery in passing, and adds a few details that may be drawn from now-lost sources or from oral tradition. He says the mound was locally known as the Seal Stane No, which is a Scots dialect phrase meaning roughly the sealed stone hill, which implies that the community had always known the mound was sealed in a particular way, different from an ordinary raised piece of ground. He says there were traditions in the area that the mound should not be disturbed, and that these traditions were strong enough that several previous attempts to investigate it had been abandoned, one of them reportedly because the workers involved became frightened. He does not specify what they were frightened of. He also adds a detail about the bones found in the chamber that is interesting, in light of subsequent developments in physical anthropology. He says that one of the people present at the opening, a man with some medical training, made a note that the skeletal remains, or what could be identified of them given their fragile state, appeared unusual in certain respects. He does not specify what those respects were, citing only the contemporary observer's statement that the bones did not look quite right without further elaboration. This is the kind of claim that is easy to dismiss and difficult to evaluate. 18th century observers were not trained osteologists. Their impressions of skeletal remains were filtered through limited experience and whatever preconceptions they brought to the moment. The remark might mean nothing at all, or it might be pointing at something that the observer noticed and did not have the framework to articulate properly. The bones did not survive. They were too fragile to be preserved, and by the early 19th century had crumbled entirely. Whatever they might have told a modern physical anthropologist is gone. What remains is the paper trail, fragmentary and suggestive, and the larger question of what was in that mound and why. To find any kind of answer, or at least any direction in which to look for an answer, you have to understand the broader context of Pictish culture and the world in which Pictish Scotland existed. Because one of the most underappreciated aspects of early medieval Scotland is how connected it was to the wider world. We tend to think of northern Scotland in the first millennium as remote, isolated, at the edge of the known world, and geographically, there is something to this. It is far from the Mediterranean centres of late Roman civilization. It is far from the continental heartlands of Frankish and Germanic culture. It is, in many ways, peripheral. But the sea does not isolate. The sea connects, and the North Atlantic was, in the first millennium AD, a highway. A cold, dangerous, storm-swept highway, but a highway nonetheless, used by peoples who had been navigating it for centuries and who had developed extraordinary maritime skills in the process. The Celts of the Atlantic fringe, including the ancestors and contemporaries of the Picts, were accomplished seafarers. The Currach, a boat of wicker and hide that sounds impossibly fragile to modern ears, was capable of making open ocean voyages that should astonish us. The voyage of St. Brendan, recorded in early medieval Irish tradition, describes a journey across the Atlantic that many scholars now take seriously as a real event, perhaps reaching Iceland, perhaps reaching Greenland, perhaps reaching the coast of North America. When Norse settlers arrived in Iceland in the 9th century, they found Irish monks already living there in stone cells, monks who had sailed there in currachs and called the island Thule, and lived there in austere solitude for generations. The point is that the North Atlantic was not an impassable barrier in the first millennium AD. It was a route. A difficult one, yes, a punishing one, but a route that people with the right knowledge and the right vessels and the right motivation were capable of navigating. The Picts, living on the northeastern coast of Scotland, were positioned at a natural waypoint on the Atlantic route. Their coastline faces north and east into the cold waters that eventually connect to Scandinavia in one direction and to Iceland and beyond in another. There is archaeological evidence of contact between Pictland and Scandinavia that predates the Viking Age by centuries. There is evidence of contact with Ireland, which itself had connections stretching across the Atlantic. There is evidence of contact with continental Europe through the North Sea trade routes. None of this proves that exotic objects from distant places ended up in a Pictish burial mound in Aberdeenshire in the first millennium AD, but it establishes that the world was more connected than we often assume, and that the presence of unusual or foreign objects in a Pictish context should not be automatically categorized as impossible. The Sutton Hoo ship burial in Suffolk, Anglo-Saxon, and dating to roughly 625 AD, contained objects from Scandinavia, from Byzantium, from France, from Sweden. A ruler's burial in 7th century England reflected connections that spanned the known world. Pictish culture, which was sophisticated, and which existed in a maritime context with documented international connections, should not be assumed to be less cosmopolitan just because we have found less evidence of it. What we have found is selective. What has survived is partial. And what was opened in that Aberdeenshire mound in 1774, and then inadequately described and eventually lost, is a gap in the record that cannot be filled from this side of the centuries. But the gap has a shape, and the shape points in some interesting directions. The most widely discussed and most academically careful interpretation of the 1774 discovery, at least among the small number of scholars who have taken it seriously enough to discuss, focuses on the possibility that the mound contained objects that had arrived in Pictland through trade or diplomatic exchange. This interpretation does not require anything exotic or impossible. It only requires that Pictish leaders, like leaders throughout the early medieval world, received gifts from distant contacts, and that some of those gifts ended up in burials. This is a completely reasonable hypothesis. High-status burials in this period frequently contain exotic objects. The Byzantine silver that showed up at Sutton Hoo, the Egyptian blue glass that appears in pre-Roman Britain, the cowrie shells from the Indian Ocean that appear in Viking graves in Norway. Objects travelled enormous distances in the ancient and medieval world, passing through many hands, traded and retraded, gifted and regifted, until they ended up very far from where they started. If the plate described by Cordner as showing figures in a style he could not place in any European tradition was a diplomatic gift, or a traded object, or an object captured in a raid, it might have come from any number of directions. Byzantine, possible. The Picts had indirect contact with the Byzantine world through the network of early Christian connections that linked monasteries from Ireland to the eastern Mediterranean. Arabic or North African, also possible. The early medieval Islamic world had trade contacts that reached surprising distances, and objects of North African or Middle Eastern origin have been found in contexts across early medieval Europe. But there is a direction that this interpretation rarely considers seriously, and that is westward. Because if the North Atlantic was a route that could be travelled in one direction, it could be travelled in both. The pre-Columbian history of the Americas is a subject that has been systematically, sometimes aggressively, stripped of its complexity by a particular narrative about the isolation of the New World before 1492. This narrative has been loosening for decades as evidence accumulates that it is simply not accurate. The Norse settlements at Lance or Meadows in Newfoundland, confirmed by archaeology and dating to around 1000 AD, established beyond any reasonable doubt that people were crossing the North Atlantic between Europe and North America well before Columbus. The Norse sagas describe multiple voyages to a land they called Vinland. Leif Erikson is generally credited with a significant expedition around 1000 AD, but the sagas suggest earlier and later contacts as well. But the Norse voyages are only the most well-documented North Atlantic crossings, and they were not the earliest. The population of Iceland before the Norse arrived included Irish monks who had sailed there. Those same Irish monks, or their contemporaries and successors, were sailing the North Atlantic with a regularity that deserves more serious attention than it typically gets. The question is not really whether early medieval Irish and British sailors were crossing the North Atlantic. They were. The question is how far they went, and what they found, and what came back with them. The Pictish symbol stones include at least one image that has generated significant debate over many years. A symbol that appears on a stone from the area of Shandwick, on the east coast of Scotland, shows a figure that has been interpreted in various ways. The mainstream interpretation is that it is a stylized depiction of a local animal or a symbolic form, but a minority of scholars and a larger number of interested non-specialists have noted that it bears a resemblance to artistic conventions found in certain pre-Columbian North American traditions. This claim should be treated carefully. It is easy to find resemblances between any two complex visual traditions if you are looking for them, and pareidolia, the tendency of human pattern recognition to find familiar shapes in ambiguous material, is a real and well-documented phenomenon. The history of archaeology is littered with claimed resemblances between ancient art traditions that turned out to mean nothing at all about contact or connection. But it is also true that the question of pre-Columbian transatlantic contact is not a fringe topic anymore. It is a genuinely active area of research, with new tools available, genetic, archaeobotanical, chemical, that are capable of detecting connections that previous generations of scholars could only speculate about. The presence of American cultivated plants in European contexts before 1492, the presence of tobacco and cocaine residues in Egyptian mummies, the presence of genetic markers in the populations of Pacific islands that point to contact with South America, all of these are findings that have forced a reconsideration of the standard narrative about isolation and first contact. In this context, the possibility that an unusual object in a first millennium Pictish mound might point toward contact, direct or indirect, with the pre-Columbian Americas is not automatically absurd. It is not proven. It is not even close to proven. But it is not the kind of thing that should be dismissed without actually examining the evidence. And the evidence, in the case of the 1774 mound, is that the objects found inside did not fit the known Pictish tradition, did not fit any known European tradition of the period, and prompted a trained 18th century antiquarian to compare them to art traditions he had seen in books about non-European cultures. That is not proof of anything, but it is a data point that deserves to be held in mind as we go further into the story. Before we can go further into what was found, we need to spend some time with the land itself, because Scotland in the first millennium was not simply a northern appendage of Britain. It was a place with its own deep history, its own layers of settlement and culture and memory, and those layers are written into the landscape in ways that are still being uncovered. The mound in Aberdeenshire that was opened in 1774 was not alone. It existed within a landscape dense with ancient monuments. The northeast of Scotland has one of the highest concentrations of prehistoric and early historic monuments in all of Britain. There are standing stone circles, recumbent stone circles, of a type unique to this region. Cairns, long barrows, hill forts, souterrains, the underground stone passages whose purpose remains debated, earth houses, and yes, mounds. Mounds of various sizes and ages and traditions, some of them Neolithic, some of them Bronze Age, some of them Iron Age, and some of them of uncertain date. The Pictish culture was not working in a blank landscape. It was working in a landscape that was already ancient and layered, that already carried the marks of peoples who had come before, and the Picts engaged with that landscape in ways we do not fully understand. Their symbol stones sometimes appear to be placed near older monuments. Their carvings sometimes appear on stones that were already standing when the Picts encountered them. There is a sense in which the Pictish symbolic tradition was, at least in part, in dialogue with an even older past that we can barely see. The Neolithic peoples of the Scottish northeast, the people who built the recumbent stone circles and the long cairns, were there for thousands of years before the Picts. Their monuments are enormous and elaborate and were clearly the product of a sophisticated social organization. What happened to them, whether they were absorbed into later populations or displaced, whether they left descendants who became the Iron Age peoples who preceded the Picts in the region, is not fully understood. But their monuments remained, and the people who came after lived around them and with them and, in some cases, built upon them. A mound in this landscape carries multiple possible layers. A mound that appears Pictish might have a Neolithic core. A Pictish burial might be placed in a location that already had ceremonial significance from centuries earlier. The 1774 mound is described as being a clearly artificial feature, not a natural rise in the ground, but that does not tell us when it was first built, or whether it was used or modified more than once across a long span of time. If the mound was first raised in the Neolithic and then re-entered and modified in the Pictish period, the objects inside might reflect layers of deposition from very different periods with very different cultural contexts. This is not a hypothesis that can be confirmed from the 1774 accounts, which do not describe any stratigraphy, any sense of different layers of material that might indicate multiple periods of use. But it is a possibility that should be held in mind. What the accounts do describe is a single sealed chamber, intact, and apparently opened only once before 1774. That implies a single act of closure, a single moment when whoever built or used this chamber last put the objects inside, sealed the roof, and left. Who were they? What were they doing? What did the chamber mean to them? To try to answer any of these questions, you have to enter the world of Pictish religious and ritual practice. And that world is, to put it plainly, almost entirely invisible to us. What we know about Pictish religion comes from a combination of oblique references in sources written by people who were not Pictish, archaeological evidence that is difficult to interpret, and inference from the symbol tradition on the stones. None of these sources is direct. None of them gives us anything like an insider account of what the Picts believed, how they understood the world, what their relationship to the dead was, or what they thought happened after death. The written references come mostly from early Christian sources, Irish and Northumbrian, that describe the conversion of the Picts to Christianity. Saint Columba, the Irish monk who founded the monastery on Iona in 563 AD, made a famous visit to the court of the Pictish king Bride in the 6th century, according to his biographer Adomnan. The account describes Columba competing with the king's druids, performing miracles, and making a generally favourable impression. The Picts were not converted at once, but Christianity made significant inroads in Pictland from the 6th century onward. But what did Christianity displace? Adomnan's account of Columba's visit refers to Pictish druids, which implies a pre-Christian religious tradition of some kind. The druids of the Celtic world are themselves a source of enormous scholarly controversy. The classical sources describe them as priests, philosophers, judges, and keepers of oral tradition. They are associated with an elaborate cosmology, a belief in the immortality of the soul, a sophisticated astronomical knowledge, and practices including, according to some classical sources, human sacrifice. But these descriptions come from outsiders, from Romans and Greeks who had specific reasons to portray the Druids in particular ways, and they cannot be taken at face value. What the archaeological evidence for pre-Christian religious practice in northern Scotland shows is equally difficult to interpret. There are deposits of objects in watery places, rivers and bogs and lochs that follow a pattern of deliberate deposition rather than accidental loss. Objects were thrown into water, placed in bogs, dropped into springs, clearly as offerings of some kind. This pattern is extremely well documented across the Celtic world and is taken as evidence of a tradition of votive deposits, offerings to supernatural powers associated with water and the underworld. There are also deposits in pits and shafts, in the earth itself, which have been found at various Scottish sites. Objects buried not as grave goods, not with a body, but on their own, placed carefully and then covered over. The interpretation of these deposits is difficult. They might be offerings. They might be hoards hidden for later retrieval. They might be objects placed out of the world for reasons that we cannot reconstruct. The sealed chamber in the 1774 mound is a different kind of thing from a votive deposit in a bog. It is too elaborate, too deliberately constructed, to be simply a hiding place or a casual burial. The effort that went into building a stone chamber, sealing it, and apparently marking it with a mound overhead implies a significant act, a deliberate and meaningful placement of whatever was inside. If there were human remains in the chamber, as the accounts suggest, it was a burial. But it was a burial of a particular and unusual kind. The effort of the construction suggests high status. The sealing of the chamber suggests finality. The objects inside, if Cordner's description can be trusted at all, suggest connections or associations that went beyond the ordinary. In early medieval Scotland, the tradition of placing the dead in elaborate stone chambers echoes at some remove the much older tradition of the Neolithic passage tombs and long cairns. But the Picts were not building passage tombs in the Neolithic style. They had their own mortuary practices, as we have seen, which were typically simpler and less elaborate. The chamber in the 1774 mound, if it was genuinely Pictish in date, was doing something unusual within that tradition. Unless the tradition we think we understand is not the complete picture. Unless there were Pictish burial practices that we simply have not found much evidence for, because the evidence is locked inside mounds that were sealed and have not been opened, or that were opened in circumstances like 1774 without systematic recording. This is a real possibility. The Pictish period in Scotland has been intensively studied for the last century and a half, but the archaeology is still incomplete. Large stretches of Pictland have not been professionally surveyed. Many features in the landscape have not been systematically excavated. The picture we have of Pictish society is assembled from a relatively small number of well-studied sites and a larger number of surface observations. There could be a whole tradition of elaborate Pictish burial chambers that we have simply not found yet, or found and not connected to each other, or found in poorly recorded circumstances and lost to the record. The mound opened in 1774 might be the only example we have of something that was once more common. Let us turn now to the wider world in which Pictish Scotland existed, and to a particular question that has occupied scholars of early medieval Britain for generations without producing a satisfying answer: the question of what happened to the Picts. In 843 AD, or thereabouts, a man named Sinead mac Ailpin, known in later tradition as Kenneth mac Alpin, became king of the Picts. He was also king of the Dal Riata, the Gaelic kingdom that had established itself in the west of Scotland, originating from Ireland. The unification of these two kingdoms under one ruler is traditionally regarded as the foundation of the Kingdom of Scotland. And the Picts, in the conventional historical narrative, disappear from the record shortly after this point. By the late 9th century, there are no more references to a Pictish king, no more Pictish royal lineage. The kingdom that had existed for centuries, that had fought Rome and defeated Viking raids and produced extraordinary art, simply stops being named. The usual explanation is assimilation. The Picts were absorbed into the Gaelic Scottish kingdom that succeeded them. Their language was replaced by Gaelic. Their royal tradition was folded into a new dynastic structure. Their cultural identity was, over the course of a generation or two, subsumed. But this explanation has always felt slightly unsatisfying to historians who look at it closely, because the rate of assimilation implied is remarkably fast. Cultures do not usually disappear in a generation. Languages do not usually be replaced that quickly unless something dramatic forces the replacement. The disappearance of the Picts from the historical record after 843 is almost suspiciously complete. There have been alternative explanations proposed. Some historians have suggested that the Picts were not simply absorbed but destroyed or displaced, that what happened in the mid-9th century was not a peaceful unification but a conquest, and that the completeness of their disappearance from the record reflects not gradual assimilation but deliberate erasure. The victors, in this telling, rewrote the history, and the Picts vanished from the record because the new rulers of Scotland did not want them in the record. This is not a crazy hypothesis. The systematic destruction of a conquered people's cultural identity is a well-documented phenomenon across many periods of history. If the Gaelic kings who established themselves over Pictland wanted to create a unified Gaelic kingdom, suppressing Pictish cultural markers, prohibiting the use of Pictish language and symbols, and eventually erasing the memory of a distinct Pictish identity, would be consistent with practices we know from many other contexts. The symbol stones, interestingly, stopped being produced at roughly this period. The last securely dated Pictish symbol stones are from the 9th century. After that, there are no new stones being carved with the old symbols. The tradition simply ends. Was it ended deliberately? Was the carving of symbols prohibited as part of a cultural suppression? Or did it simply fade as the people who understood the symbols and the tradition that sustained them were integrated into a new cultural framework that did not need them? We do not know, but the timing is suggestive. And then there are the sealed mounds in the landscape of the northeast of Scotland that the local communities remembered and told stories about and warned people not to disturb. If the Pictish cultural erasure was deliberate, was it complete? Were there pockets of the old tradition that survived, hidden, maintained in secret, visible only in the folk memory of communities that remembered not to dig? The Seal Stane No, the Sealed Stone Hill, a name given by the Scots-speaking farming community of 18th-century Aberdeenshire to a mound they had been warned about for generations. The name implies that the community knew the mound was deliberately sealed, not just a natural rise in the ground. Someone, at some point before the Gaelic and Scots cultures that succeeded the Picts completely obscured the memory, had told these people that there was something sealed in that hill and that it should not be opened. That warning survived for between 800 and 1200 years, not in writing, not in any formal record, just in the living memory of a community, passed from generation to generation, distorted and mythologized and colored by whatever later cultural frameworks it passed through, but surviving. Until one autumn afternoon, in 1774, when a farmer decided that practical need outweighed accumulated warning and opened the seal. Let us try to reconstruct, as carefully as the evidence allows, what that chamber might have looked like in the moment before the farmer disturbed it. A stone-built chamber, roughly rectangular, perhaps 2 meters long and 1 meter wide and less than a meter high, too small to stand in. The walls of dry-laid stone, carefully fitted, showing the same attention to craft that characterizes Pictish stonework elsewhere. A flat capstone across the top, heavy enough to require effort to move, placed with enough precision that the chamber below it remained effectively sealed against water and air for centuries. Inside, in complete darkness, the objects that had been placed there at the moment of closing, the bones of whoever lay there, crumbling and fragile from the centuries, the carved stones with their Pictish symbols, smooth and cool to the touch, the metal plate with its figures, lying face up or face down or propped against a wall, the ceramic vessel with its dark residue, intact until the air reached it. Who placed these objects here? When? With what ceremony? What prayers or words or gestures accompanied the sealing of the chamber? We do not know any of this, but we can look at analogies from the early medieval world and try to fill in the silence with something plausible. Across early medieval Europe and Britain, the practice of placing the dead with meaningful objects was common but varied enormously by culture, period, and the religion of the community performing the burial. Pre-Christian traditions typically placed objects that the deceased might need or use in another life. Food, weapons, tools, jewelry, animals in some cases. The object was often personally meaningful, associated with the identity of the person in life. Christian traditions varied. Some early Christian communities continued to place objects with the dead, particularly personal items, while others moved towards simpler burial practices. The transformation from elaborate to simple was not uniform and not always fast. In Pictland, the conversion to Christianity proceeded unevenly through the 6th, 7th, and 8th centuries. Some areas were Christianized relatively early, others maintained older practices longer. The northeast of Scotland, which is where the 1774 mound was located, was not necessarily the earliest or most thoroughly Christianized part of Pictland. The monasteries and churches of the early Pictish Church were concentrated in particular areas, and parts of the northeast may have remained in a more mixed religious state well into the 7th or 8th centuries. If the burial in the mound predates full Christianization of the local community, or belongs to a community that maintained older practices alongside Christian ones, then the elaborate construction and the careful placement of objects makes sense within a pre-Christian Pictish tradition of which we have almost no direct knowledge. If it postdates Christianization but belongs to someone who was seen as having special status that transcended the ordinary categories of Christian burial, then it might represent a deliberate archaism, a conscious choice to bury this person in the old way, with the old objects, in defiance of, or in parallel with the new tradition. Either of these possibilities makes the objects inside potentially more interesting, because if the chamber was sealed with deliberate care, by people who understood what they were doing, then the objects inside were chosen deliberately. They were not accidental. They were not random. They meant something to the people who placed them there. What might a metal plate with figured decoration, in a style that an 18th century antiquarian found impossible to place in any European tradition, have meant to a Pictish community in the 7th or 8th century. Here is where we have to make a significant detour. Because to understand what might have been in that mound, it helps to understand the state of pre-Columbian North American archaeology and what we now know, and what is still being debated, about connections between the ancient and medieval world and the Americas. The standard story, the one taught in most schools, is that the Americas were entirely isolated from the rest of the world between the initial peopling of the continents, which occurred through the Bering Land Bridge and possibly by sea along the Pacific coast, sometime between 15,000 and 30,000 years ago, and the Norse contact around 1000 AD. In this story, the Americas developed their civilizations entirely independently, and no meaningful contact occurred between the Old World and the New World until Columbus in 1492. This story began to crack in 1960 when a Norwegian-Canadian archaeologist named Helge Ingstad followed a lead from a Newfoundland fisherman to a site called Lancer or Meadows on the northern tip of Newfoundland and found the unmistakable remains of a Norse settlement. 8 buildings, smithing equipment, a bronze ring pin of Norse type, bog iron smelting. The site was dated to around 1000 AD. The Norse had been there. The sagas about Vinland were not pure legend, but Lancer Meadows established only the Norse contact, and only at one site, and only around 1000 AD. The question of earlier contacts, and contacts by other peoples, remained open, and the evidence that has accumulated in the decades since is striking. Genetic studies of modern Native American populations have found, in certain groups, particularly in the Amazon basin and in parts of South America, genetic markers that point to ancestry from Australasian or Polynesian sources, which implies ancient transoceanic contact from the Pacific side. Sweet potatoes, a plant domesticated in the Americas, were being cultivated in Polynesia before European contact, and the Polynesian word for the sweet potato is related to the Quechua word, implying direct transfer. Bottle gourds, another American plant, appear in archaeological contexts in Africa and Asia before they should be present if the Americas were truly isolated. On the Atlantic side, the evidence is less clearly established but accumulating. Traces of tobacco and cocaine, both American plants, have been found in Egyptian mummies, and while this finding has been contested, the contest itself has been productive, forcing re-examination of assumptions about what was and was not possible. DNA studies of pre-Columbian remains have sometimes produced anomalous results that resist clean explanation within the isolation model. None of this proves regular contact between early medieval Scotland and pre-Columbian North America. The Norse contact at Lancer Meadows was brief and limited, and there is no evidence of sustained exchange between the Norse and the indigenous peoples they encountered, at least not in the archaeological record we have found. The Irish monastic voyages into the North Atlantic left almost no trace in the material record. Whatever the monks of the early medieval church carried back from their Atlantic voyages, if they brought anything back at all, is not clearly identifiable in any collection. But here is the question that the 1774 mound keeps forcing back to the surface. If there was a metal plate with figured designs in a style that an educated 18th century observer could not place in any European tradition, what traditions existed that might account for it? And if one answer is that it came from somewhere outside Europe, which traditions outside Europe might have been in any kind of contact with early medieval Scotland? The Norse connection runs north and east. Scandinavia, Iceland, the Arctic. Not to North America in any documented pre-1000 AD context. The Irish monastic connection runs west and north, into the North Atlantic, potentially as far as Greenland or beyond. And the Pictish connection to the Irish world was significant. The monastery at Iona was an Irish foundation on Pictish soil, and Iona was one of the most important religious and cultural centres in early medieval northern Europe. The connections that flowed through Iona touched the entire North Atlantic monastic world, including those monks in their stone cells on Iceland who had made the crossing in their hide boats. This is not a direct chain of evidence from Pictland to North America. It is a set of connections that, in principle, might have allowed objects or knowledge or people to travel very long distances through multiple intermediaries. A Pictish nobleman might have received a gift from an Irish merchant who had received it from a monk who had received it from a sailor who had been somewhere no one had mapped. In a world without mass communication, without systematic record-keeping of trade, without the kind of documentation that would let us trace these chains of transmission, this kind of long-distance movement of objects is precisely the kind of thing that leaves no clear record, but it can leave a material trace, if the object itself survives. The object from the 1774 mound did not survive, or at least has not been found, but its description, filtered through two uncertain 18th century accounts, persists as a data point that refuses to fit cleanly into any known category. Let us talk about the forbidden history of pre-Columbian North America, because the phrase is not simply a marketing label. It reflects something real about the history of how this subject has been treated by mainstream scholarship, and understanding that history is important for evaluating the evidence. For most of the 20th century, the standard position of American archaeology was that the Americas were isolated before 1492, and that any evidence suggesting otherwise was the product of misidentification, fraud, wishful thinking, or the kind of romantic nationalism that had already done enormous damage to the field in the 19th century. The 19th century had seen a series of spectacular frauds: the Cardiff giant, various supposedly ancient inscriptions, objects planted to support theories about lost tribes and vanished civilizations that had understandably made archaeologists deeply skeptical of any claim about pre-Columbian contact. This skepticism was reasonable, but it hardened over time into something more like a defensive orthodoxy that made it difficult for legitimate anomalous evidence to receive fair evaluation. Evidence that did not fit the standard model was not simply set aside pending further investigation. It was sometimes actively attacked, its proponents dismissed as cranks or frauds before the evidence had been properly examined. The treatment of Thor Heyerdahl is instructive. Heyerdahl was a Norwegian ethnographer who, in 1947, sailed a balsa wood raft called the Kon-Tiki from Peru to Polynesia, demonstrating that such a voyage was physically possible. His hypothesis was that the settlement of Polynesia had been partly accomplished by South American peoples sailing west. This hypothesis was initially dismissed by most archaeologists. It was eventually found to be partially correct, in that genetic studies have now confirmed contact between South America and Polynesia, though the direction of that contact is still debated. But for decades, Heyerdahl's serious scientific argument was treated primarily as eccentric showmanship. The story of the Kennewick man's skeleton is another example. In 1996, a skeleton was found in the Columbia River in Washington state, dated to approximately 9,000 years ago. Analysis suggested that the skeletal morphology did not closely resemble that of modern Native American populations, and some researchers suggested it might point to earlier and more diverse waves of migration into the Americas. The response from parts of the archaeological establishment was to invoke NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, to prevent further study. A legal battle lasted years. The political and cultural dimensions of the debate overshadowed the scientific ones. This is not to say that the alternative theories about pre-Columbian contact are all correct, or that mainstream archaeology is simply suppressing the truth. Most claims about lost civilizations and ancient contacts are wrong, and the mechanisms by which bad ideas spread faster than good ones are well understood. The alternative archaeology world is full of claims that do not stand up to evidence. But there is a real phenomenon here, which is that the field has sometimes allowed political and institutional pressures to shape what evidence gets taken seriously and what does not. The result is that some genuinely anomalous findings, things that do not fit the standard model and deserve serious investigation, have been inadequately studied or have been dismissed before being properly examined. The 1774 Aberdeenshire Mound is a small example of this dynamic, at many removes. The mound was opened before systematic archaeology existed. The objects were not properly recorded. The accounts that survived were fragmentary and were never subjected to systematic scholarly analysis. The whole episode slipped through the cracks of the historical record and has never been the subject of a serious monograph or archaeological reassessment. This is not a conspiracy. It is simply the product of limited attention, limited resources, and a set of priorities that directed scholarly attention elsewhere. The northeast of Scotland has hundreds of ancient monuments, and the resources to study all of them properly do not exist. The 1774 mound was one obscure and poorly documented event in a landscape full of better documented ones. But the poorly documented ones are sometimes where the interesting questions live. Now let us consider what we know about the Pictish symbol system with fresh eyes, because it may be the most important key we have to understanding what was in that mound, and what the people who built it were trying to communicate. The symbols are not random. The scholarship of the last 50 years has made this absolutely clear. The symbols appear in consistent pairs and combinations. Certain symbols always appear with certain other symbols. Certain combinations never occur. There is a grammar to the symbol system, even if we cannot read the language it expresses. Romilly Allen, who produced the foundational study of Pictish symbol stones in 1903, identified approximately 40 distinct symbols in the Pictish repertoire. Later scholars have refined this count and identified subtypes and variants, but the core set remains roughly that size. Of these 40-odd symbols, a small number account for the majority of all occurrences. The crescent and V-rod, the double disc and Z-rod, the Pictish beast, the mirror, the comb, the rectangle, these are the most common, and they appear again and again in the same pairing structures. What do the symbols mean? The theories are numerous, and none is conclusive. One theory holds that they represent individual identities, clan or family markers perhaps, used on gravestones to identify the person buried. Another theory holds that they represent astronomical or calendrical information, encoding knowledge of the sky in a visual system that could be read without knowing the Pictish language. A third theory holds that they represent a form of heraldry, a system of territorial or political identity markers used by the Pictish nobility. A fourth theory, pursued with great energy by some researchers, holds that they represent the sounds of the Pictish language, a syllabary or logographic writing system, and that they can potentially be decoded. The decoding attempts have been made. None has produced results that the wider scholarly community has accepted. The symbols resist interpretation with a thoroughness that is itself remarkable and that has led some researchers to propose that the resistance is not accidental, that the symbols were designed to be opaque to outsiders, that they encoded meaning in a way that only initiates could decode, perhaps in a religious or ceremonial context. This is the kind of hypothesis that is very difficult to test, but it is not implausible. Symbolic systems designed to be opaque, to communicate only with those who have the key, are well documented across many cultures. Mystery traditions in the ancient Greek world, the Kabbalistic traditions of medieval Jewish mysticism, various esoteric Christian movements, all of them developed symbolic systems whose meaning was deliberately restricted to initiates and deliberately obscured to outsiders. If Pictish symbols were of this kind, then they were not primarily about external communication. They were not signs meant to be read by passers-by the way a Roman milestone conveyed distance. They were about something more internal, more exclusive, more deeply tied to the specific community and tradition that produced them. And if the objects in the sealed chamber included Pictish symbols, those symbols might not be labels or identifiers, they might be keys. Pieces of a ritual system that was meant to accompany the dead in a very specific way, for very specific reasons that only the people who placed them there understood. The carved stone with a mirror symbol, the carved stone with a crescent. These are common Pictish symbols, but their placement in a sealed chamber with unusual objects from what might be a non-European tradition creates a context that is more complex than a simple marker. What if the symbols were meant to do something in the context of the burial, to activate or protect or direct or record something in a system whose logic we have completely lost? This is speculation, but it is the kind of speculation that the evidence seems to invite, because the evidence we have points towards something more complex and more intentional than a simple high-status burial of the known type. Let us now move to a part of this story that is almost never told in the accounts of the 1774 discovery. Because the mound in Aberdeenshire was not the only sealed Pictish mound that was opened in the 18th century. It was simply the most documented. In the period between roughly 1750 and 1820, the agricultural improvement movement transformed the Scottish countryside. Fields were enclosed. Inefficient strip farming was replaced with more productive methods. Drainage was improved. And in the process of this transformation, enormous numbers of ancient monuments were destroyed, altered, or opened by farmers who encountered them in the process of improving their land. Most of these encounters went completely unrecorded. A farmer broke through the roof of a souterrain, found some pottery and bones, shrugged, and filled it in. A clearance of fieldstones uncovered the outer wall of a Neolithic long cairn, and the stones were taken for fencing. A mound that had sat in a field since the Iron Age was levelled because it interfered with ploughing. The loss of archaeological information in this period was catastrophic, but it was also, in a handful of cases, documented by local ministers and educated landowners who recognized that something significant was being found and wrote it down. The Statistical Account of Scotland, a remarkable survey of all Scottish parishes undertaken in the 1790s, contains many references to ancient monuments found or disturbed on agricultural land, and some of these references include descriptions of objects found in mounds and chambers. Reading through the relevant parish entries for the northeast of Scotland in the statistical account is a strange exercise. The ministers who compiled the entries vary enormously in their interest in and knowledge of antiquities. Some dismiss the ancient monuments in their parishes in a line or two. Others provide detailed descriptions that are genuinely useful to modern archaeologists. And scattered through these accounts are descriptions of mounds opened and objects found that, placed together, begin to suggest a pattern. Several entries mention mounds in the northeast that were sealed in ways similar to the 1774 mound, with deliberately placed capstones and dry stone chambers rather than simple earth burials. One entry describes an object found in such a chamber near the coast of Banffshire that the minister describes as a piece of decorated bone or ivory, the function of which he cannot determine. Another describes what sounds like a small carved wooden object found in a chamber near the Moray Firth, which had been so well preserved by the dry conditions inside the chamber that the wood still showed traces of colour, though he does not specify what colour or what design. These references are fragmentary and uncertain. They cannot be combined into a clear picture, but they hint at a tradition of unusual burial practice in the northeast of Scotland, a tradition involving carefully constructed sealed chambers and objects whose description consistently puzzles the 18th century observers who encountered them. This hint becomes more interesting when you consider the geography. The northeast of Scotland, Aberdeenshire, Banffshire, the Moray Firth coast, is precisely the heartland of the most concentrated Pictish symbol stone tradition. The greatest density of Pictish stones is in this region. The most elaborate stones, with the most complex imagery, are in this region. The Pictish metalwork tradition, the extraordinary silver hoards that have been found in this part of Scotland, is also centred in this region. This was the core of Pictland, not a peripheral zone. And it is here, in this core zone, that these unusual sealed chambers seem to cluster. One more detail from the statistical account entries deserves attention. A minister in a parish whose specific location is frustratingly not given describes what he calls a stone carved with marks he cannot interpret, found in a mound on his parishioner's land, and notes that a local man, elderly and reputedly a keeper of old tradition, told him that these marks were known to the old people of the area and that they were a kind of language, though he could not say what language or what it said. The old man told the minister that the mounds with sealed chambers were known in local tradition as the houses of the makers of marks, and that they should not be disturbed because the marks inside were still doing what they were made to do. The houses of the makers of marks, the people who carved the Pictish symbols, and their mounds were still, in the 18th century, understood by some older members of the local community as being functionally active, not simply historical curiosities, but places where something was still happening, where the marks were still working. This is folklore, not evidence. But folklore carries memory, even if it carries it in distorted and transformed ways. The community that maintained a warning about the seal stain no for centuries was not maintaining it in a vacuum. They were maintaining it because it meant something to their ancestors, and their ancestors had passed down a sense, even without the specific knowledge, that the mound contained something that mattered. The farmers who opened these mounds in the late 18th century were not simply removing obstacles to ploughing. They were, inadvertently, and without knowing it, unsealing the work of the makers of marks. Now, I want to take you somewhere very different from the windswept fields of Aberdeenshire. I want to take you to the coast of what is now Nova Scotia, in Canada, and to a set of findings that have been generating controversy for decades, but that have never been fully resolved. In 1971, a retired schoolteacher named Frederick Pohl published a book called Atlantic Crossings Before Columbus, in which he gathered evidence for pre-Columbian contact between Europe and the Americas. Pohl was not a credentialed academic, and his book was dismissed by most archaeologists of the period. But some of the specific evidence he cited has proven more durable than his overall reception suggested it would. Among the things Pohl documented were a series of carved stones found at various sites in Nova Scotia and the surrounding region. Some of these stones bore markings that were claimed to resemble European runic inscriptions. Others were claimed to resemble other Old World writing systems. The scholarly consensus was that these carvings were either natural erosion patterns or modern fakes, a verdict that was pronounced with varying degrees of rigor depending on the specific stone. But there is one category of carved stone from the Nova Scotia region that has not been as easily dismissed, and that connects in an interesting way to the Pictish tradition. A small number of stones from sites in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick bear markings that do not resemble runes, do not resemble any of the alphabetic scripts that have been proposed for pre-Columbian contact, and instead show abstract designs that have been compared to the symbol tradition of the Picts of northern Scotland. The comparison is not exact. It is not the kind of thing where you can place a Pictish stone and a Nova Scotia stone side by side and say these are identical. The designs are not identical. But the structural vocabulary of certain markings, the use of a limited set of abstract symbols in consistent combinations, the emphasis on curves and interlocking forms, has struck a small number of researchers as worth noting. This observation has been made very cautiously, by very few people, and it has not generated significant scholarly attention. It sits in the pile of anomalous observations that have not been explained, but that have also not been rigorously investigated. Here is what makes it interesting in the context of the 1774 mound. The Pictish symbol tradition is almost entirely confined to Scotland, with a handful of possible outliers elsewhere in Britain. If you were to find Pictish-adjacent symbols anywhere outside Scotland, the most likely explanation would be that someone who knew the Pictish tradition had been there. And the question of whether early medieval Scottish or Irish sailors reached the coast of what is now Atlantic Canada is not, as we have established, a question that can be answered with a simple no. The Norse reached Newfoundland around 1000 AD. The Irish monks were in Iceland by the 7th century. The distances from Iceland to Greenland, and from Greenland to the coast of Labrador and Newfoundland, are not prohibitive for experienced North Atlantic sailors. The specific stretch of sea between Greenland and Labrador, the Davis Strait, was crossed multiple times by the Norse. Whether it was crossed by Irish or Scottish sailors before or during the Norse period is not established, but it is not impossible. If it was, what would we expect to find? Not major settlements with rich archaeological records, probably. The Irish monastic tradition valued poverty and austerity, not monument building on a grand scale. Small stone cells, careful carvings, objects that were portable and meaningful, nothing that would necessarily leave a large footprint in the landscape, which is precisely the kind of evidence that is hardest to find and easiest to dismiss. The carved stones of Nova Scotia remain contested. The comparison to Pictish symbols has not been formally published in a major peer-reviewed venue, at least not in a way that has generated sustained scholarly debate. But the observation exists, and the context we have been building over the course of this narrative gives it a slightly different quality than it might have had in isolation. It does not prove anything, but it is one more piece of something that refuses to resolve into a clean and simple picture. In 1993, a small excavation was undertaken near the site of the 1774 mound discovery. I say small, and I mean genuinely small. It was conducted by a local archaeological society, not a professional archaeological team with institutional backing, and it was published in a very limited form in a regional journal that is not widely available outside Scotland. The excavation was prompted by a report that agricultural work in the area had turned up some stone fragments that might be related to the original discovery, and the society decided to investigate. What they found was limited but interesting. They confirmed that a mound had existed in the approximate location described in the 18th century accounts. The mound itself had been substantially disturbed by more than 2 centuries of agricultural activity, but the outlines of a stone feature beneath it were detectable. They recovered a number of stone fragments that appeared to be from a deliberately constructed chamber, matching the descriptions in the earlier accounts. They also recovered a small number of artifacts. A fragment of what appeared to be a carved stone, with part of a curved design visible that might be the remnant of a symbol. A piece of fired clay whose characteristics did not match any known local ceramic tradition. And a fragment of metal, very small, badly corroded, which they sent for analysis. The metal analysis came back as bronze, but with an unusual tin content and some trace elements that the analysis laboratory noted were not characteristic of Scottish or Irish Bronze Age or early medieval bronze production. They noted that the trace element profile was more consistent with continental or Mediterranean sources, but they could not rule out other origins. They suggested the fragment might be from an object imported from continental Europe. This is not dramatic evidence. A small fragment of bronze with an unusual composition could have arrived in the northeast of Scotland through ordinary trade routes, through gift exchange, through any number of mundane pathways that had nothing to do with anything exotic. But it is consistent with the 18th century accounts of an unusual metal object in the chamber. The 1993 report was published and essentially forgotten. It has not been followed up with further excavation. The site is in private farmland, and there is no particular institutional interest in pursuing it. The regional journal it was published in has a small circulation, and the report has not been digitized or made widely available. It is possible to visit the site today, if you know where to look. The field has changed. The mound is gone, leveled by decades of cultivation. There is no marker, no signpost, no indication to a passerby that anything significant ever stood here. The seal stain No is sealed again, in a different way, under the ordinary surface of an ordinary Scottish field. But the questions it opened in 1774 have not been sealed back in. They have been moving through the scholarly and popular imaginations ever since, generating debates that the original discovery never fully resolved because it was never fully documented, never fully investigated, and never fully explained. We are going to spend some time now in a different but deeply connected territory, because to understand the full significance of what might have been in the Aberdeenshire Mound, you need to understand the pre-Columbian cultures of North America's Atlantic coast and what they were capable of, and what they left behind, and how their history has been distorted by the same forces that have made the pre-Columbian contact question so difficult to navigate fairly. The indigenous peoples of the Atlantic coast of North America, in the period we are talking about, roughly 500 to 1000 AD, were not simple or primitive. They were culturally sophisticated, socially complex, economically networked, and in some cases producing art and material culture of remarkable quality. The woodland period cultures of the northeastern Atlantic coast were part of a trading network that extended across enormous distances. Objects made in the Great Lakes region ended up in coastal Newfoundland. Marine shells from the Gulf of Mexico showed up in interior Ohio. Copper from the Lake Superior region was traded as far east as coastal Maine and as far south as the Gulf Coast. These were not isolated communities scraping a marginal existence from the forest. They were participants in a network of exchange that covered half a continent. The art traditions of these cultures were sophisticated and varied. The geometric designs of certain woodland period pottery, the carved bone and antler objects of the northern Algonquian tradition, the woodworking of the groups who would later be known as the various nations of the northeastern woodlands. These traditions produced objects that could, to someone unfamiliar with them, appear to belong to no category they recognized. What did these cultures look like from the sea? If you were a sailor from Ireland or Scotland approaching the coast of Atlantic Canada in the 7th or 8th century AD, what would you have found? Settled fishing and hunter-gatherer communities, coastal villages, people who were adapted to the sea and who would have been visible on the shoreline, people who would have had goods to trade and who would have been curious about strangers arriving by water. The Mi'kmaq people of what is now Atlantic Canada and northeastern New England have oral traditions that speak of contact with strange visitors from the east in ancient times. These traditions are not documented in written sources before the European colonial period, and they have been interpreted in many ways. They might reflect memory of Norse contact. They might reflect contact with other Atlantic voyagers. They might be entirely mythological in origin. But the oral traditions of indigenous peoples of the Americas have, in a number of cases, preserved accurate memory of events that predated European writing systems. The oral history is not inherently less reliable than the written record. It is simply organized differently and transmitted through different mechanisms. If there was contact between early medieval Atlantic European sailors, Irish or Scottish, and the indigenous peoples of the Atlantic coast of North America, it would have left traces. The traces might be in the oral traditions of both sides. They might be in the material record if the right sites have been found and the right questions asked. They might be in the objects that changed hands and ended up in places where they did not belong by any simple account. An object from the Atlantic coast of North America, traded or gifted, making its way back with a returning sailor to Ireland or Scotland, and eventually finding its way into a Pictish burial chamber in Aberdeenshire, is a chain of transmission that is long and uncertain and involves many assumptions. But it is not physically or logically impossible. And the time period is roughly right, if the mound was sealed sometime between the 7th and 9th centuries. This is one hypothesis. There are others. The object might have come from Scandinavia via a different set of long-distance trade connections. It might have come from the Middle East through the Irish monastic network and its Mediterranean connections. It might have been made in Britain by a craftsperson working in an unusual tradition we have not identified. It might have been something else entirely, misidentified or misdescribed by the 18th century accounts. The honest answer is that we do not know. We cannot know, not from the evidence we have. The objects are gone. The mound is leveled. The accounts are fragmentary and unreliable in the specific ways that 18th century amateur accounts tend to be unreliable. But the question remains. And in the history of knowledge, questions that remain are sometimes more valuable than answers that close down inquiry. The 1774 mound is, in this sense, a productive mystery. It keeps opening outward, leading to the Picts, to the North Atlantic, to pre-Columbian contact debates, to the nature of the historical record and its gaps, to the way knowledge is created and preserved and lost. There is a category of historical mystery that I find more compelling than any other, and the 1774 Aberdeenshire mound belongs to it. It is the mystery that is not a mystery of pure absence, not a case where all the evidence has simply vanished, but a mystery of partial presence. A case where enough survives to tell you that something happened, something significant and unusual, but not enough survives to tell you what that something was. These partial mysteries are, in a way, the most honest representation of how history actually works. The complete record does not exist. The complete record has never existed. History is always a reconstruction from fragments, always an attempt to draw a coherent picture from incomplete evidence, always an interpretation of a partial archive. The 1774 mound is just unusually and overtly partial. What we have is this: an old mound in the northeast of Scotland, known by the local community for centuries as something that should not be disturbed. A farmer in 1774 who disturbed it anyway. A stone chamber inside, dry and sealed and old. Bones too fragile to preserve. Carved stones with Pictish symbols. A metal plate with figures that did not fit any European tradition an 18th century antiquarian could identify. A ceramic vessel that broke apart on exposure to air. And then, the objects passing into private hands and disappearing from the record. This is what we have. It is frustratingly little, but it is not nothing. And it exists within a much larger context. A context of a civilization that is itself a mystery. The Picts, whose language we cannot read, whose symbols we cannot fully decode, whose burial traditions we do not completely understand, and whose disappearance from the historical record we cannot explain to everyone's satisfaction. A civilization that existed in a region of the world with extraordinary maritime connections to the wider Atlantic. A civilization that was producing sophisticated art and elaborate metalwork at a time when the North Atlantic was being regularly crossed by people with the motivation and the vessels to do so. The 1774 discovery points in all of these directions at once. It cannot be explained simply by reference to any one of them. It requires holding multiple threads at once and being comfortable with the fact that the threads do not all pull in the same direction. That is, ultimately, what the best historical mysteries demand of us. Not the resolution of a puzzle, but the expansion of our sense of what was possible. Not a clean answer, but a richer question. Now, I want to tell you about another discovery, one that is better documented and more recent, and that throws a slightly different light on the entire question of Pictish burial practice and what might have been happening in those sealed chambers in the northeast of Scotland. In 2013, archaeologists excavating near the village of Portmahomack on the Tarbat Peninsula on the east coast of Scotland made a discovery that forced a significant reassessment of what we thought we knew about the end of the Pictish period. Portmahomack had already been established as an important early Pictish monastery, a centre of craft production and religious life that had been active from around the 6th century. What the 2013 excavation revealed was evidence of a violent destruction event dating to around 800 AD that matches the historical record of a Norse raid on Iona and other Scottish monasteries. The Portmahomack monastery had been attacked and burned. The evidence was unmistakable: charred timbers, deliberately broken sculpture, bodies of people who had died violently. The community had been destroyed, quickly and completely. But the excavation revealed something else alongside the destruction. Evidence that before the monastery was established, and alongside it during its period of operation, there had been a tradition of elaborate ritual activity at the site that predated and was distinct from the Christian monastic tradition. Evidence of feasting on a large scale. Evidence of high-status objects that did not fit the simple monastic tradition. Evidence of a community that was doing something complex and important in this place before the monks arrived and continued doing something alongside them. The implication is that Portmahomack was a significant ritual centre in the Pictish world before it was a Christian monastery, and that the monastery was established on a site that already carried tremendous religious significance for the local population. This is a pattern that is well documented elsewhere in early medieval Britain, where Christian churches and monasteries were often placed at sites that had pre-existing sanctity in the older tradition. What does this tell us about the 1774 mound? It suggests that the landscape of the Pictish northeast was organized around a network of ritual sites that we are only beginning to map, that the mounds and chambers of that landscape were part of a complex sacred geography, not random burials scattered across farmland, but deliberate placements in a landscape charged with meaning. That the effort that went into sealing the 1774 chamber was part of a larger tradition of deliberate, meaningful ritual action in the landscape. And it suggests that what was placed in those sealed chambers mattered in ways that we have not fully understood, because we have not understood the wider ritual context in which those placements were made. Let us talk about the silver. Because the Pictish silverwork that has been found in the northeast of Scotland is one of the most extraordinary collections of early medieval metalwork in all of Europe, and it bears directly on the question of what might have been in the 1774 mound. The Norreys Law hoard, found in Fife in 1819, contained Pictish silver objects of extraordinary quality, plaques decorated with Pictish symbols, pins, chains, objects that demonstrated a silver-working tradition of the highest technical accomplishment. The Pictish symbols on the silver were rendered with a precision and elegance that matched the best stone carvings. The Traprain Law treasure, found in East Lothian in 1919, was not specifically Pictish, but was found in Pictish-adjacent territory and dates to the late Roman period. It contained hundreds of pieces of Roman silver, hacked into fragments in a way that suggested it was loot or tribute, brought northward through trade or raid and cached in the ground. Some of these pieces were exquisitely decorated Roman silver, cut apart as if for bullion rather than valued as complete objects. The Street Ninian's Isle treasure, found in Shetland in 1958, was a hoard of Pictish silver of exceptional quality, buried beneath the floor of a church. Bowls, hanging bowls, a sword hilt, conical objects whose function is uncertain, all decorated with Pictish symbols and executed with extraordinary technical skill. The silver was buried sometime around 800 AD, almost certainly in response to the threat of Norse raids. These hoards reveal a Pictish silverworking tradition that was wealthy, technically sophisticated, and deeply integrated with the symbol system. The symbols were not just carved on stones, they were worked in precious metal, worn, displayed, exchanged, gifted, and buried. The metal plate described in the 1774 accounts was not described as silver. Cordner describes it as bronze, or bronze-like, though he notes the color was unusual. But the tradition of figured metalwork in Pictland was clearly sophisticated enough to produce complex objects, and the combination of Pictish symbols on carved stones with a figured metal plate in the same chamber suggests that whoever was buried there was a person of significance in the Pictish world, someone who was entitled to the full range of symbolic and material expression that Pictish culture afforded. The question of where the figural style on that plate came from, if Cordner's description is accurate, remains the central puzzle. A Pictish craftsperson working in their own tradition would have produced something recognizable as Pictish. The animals on Pictish metalwork are instantly identifiable. The style is distinctive and consistent. If the plate looked like nothing Cordner could place in any European tradition, it was either made in a tradition he was not aware of, or made in a deliberate blending of traditions that produced something unfamiliar, or brought from somewhere that was entirely outside his frame of reference. These three options have very different implications. The first implies a European or Mediterranean tradition that we should be able to identify but have not. The second implies a craftsperson who was consciously working across traditions, which itself requires an explanation of how they knew multiple traditions well enough to blend them. The third implies an origin outside Europe, which is the most radical and the most difficult to substantiate. None of them can be confirmed from the evidence we have, but none of them is impossible. And all three of them suggest that whoever was in that mound was connected to a wider world in ways that the ordinary Pictish farmer or merchant was not. What was the person like who was buried in the 1774 mound? This is a question that history does not give us the tools to answer with any confidence. We do not know the person's name. We do not know their gender, though the presence of mirror and comb symbols, if they were indeed present, has sometimes been associated with female burials in Pictish contexts, though this association is debated. We do not know their age at death. We do not know their position in Pictish society beyond the general inference that the elaborateness of their burial implies high status. But we can speculate, carefully, about what kind of person they might have been. In the Pictish world, as in many early medieval societies, the categories of political, religious, and social authority were not always cleanly separated. A king could also be a ritual specialist. A druid or priest could also be a political advisor. The keepers of the symbol tradition, whoever they were, whoever decided which symbols would be carved on which stones and what those symbols meant, would have wielded a form of power that combined the religious and the political in ways we would find unfamiliar. If the mound contained the remains of someone who was a keeper of the symbol tradition, a person who knew what the symbols meant and held the key to the visual language that bound Pictish society together, then the placement of symbolic objects in the mound takes on additional significance. It is not just grave goods, it is a complete and deliberate interment of the symbols with the one who understood them, a sealing of the knowledge inside the earth. This hypothesis is speculative, but it has a certain internal logic. If the symbols were a sacred or esoteric tradition, if their meaning was restricted to initiates, then the death of a major keeper of the tradition would create a particular kind of crisis. The knowledge might pass to a successor, or it might not, or it might pass only partially. And if the holder of the knowledge was being buried, placing the symbols in the burial would be both an act of honor and an act of completion, sealing the knowledge in the earth, because there was no longer anyone to hold it in the living world. The tradition in the 18th century oral memory that the marks inside the mounds were still doing what they were made to do might be a distorted echo of exactly this. A memory that the symbols were not simply decorative, that they had a function, a purpose, and that the sealed chamber was not a passive resting place, but an active site, a place where something was still happening even though the person who had set it in motion was gone. As we approach the end of our journey through this mystery, I want to draw a thread that connects the 1774 Aberdeenshire Mound to the wider question of pre-Columbian North America, because that connection is not as loose as it might seem. The question of what happened before Columbus is not simply an American question. It is a question about the whole Atlantic world, and its answers, when they come, will transform our understanding of early medieval Europe as much as they transform our understanding of pre-contact America. The Picts were part of the Atlantic world. They lived on the edge of it, facing it, connected to it through the sea. Their culture, Whatever it was in its full complexity was shaped by that connection, by the traffic of people and objects and ideas that moved across the North Atlantic in ways we are still mapping. The mound in Aberdeenshire is one data point in that mapping, an anomalous data point, inadequately documented, contested in its details, impossible to fully evaluate from this side of the centuries, but a data point nonetheless. In the history of science, anomalies are valuable things. Thomas Kuhn, in his influential account of how scientific revolutions happen, described the way that anomalous data accumulates at the edges of established paradigms, quietly building pressure until the paradigm can no longer contain them. The isolation of the pre-Columbian Americas is a paradigm that has been under pressure for decades, and the pressure is building. The 1,774 mound does not crack that paradigm by itself. Nothing that small and that poorly documented could do that. But it sits at the edge of the pressure zone, one more thing that does not quite fit, one more object described in terms that reach beyond the known categories. The farmer who opened that mound on that autumn afternoon in 1774 was not thinking about paradigms, he was thinking about his field. He needed the ground flat. He had a practical problem, and he solved it in the most direct way available to him, which was to dig. But in digging, he opened something that was never fully closed again. The questions that spilled out of that chamber have been circulating ever since, attaching to other questions, connecting to other mysteries, expanding into the vast and incompletely charted territory of the early medieval Atlantic world, and everything we do not yet understand about it. The seal stain No was unsealed in 1774, but what was inside it has never been fully revealed. Perhaps the most honest thing that can be said about the 1,774 discovery is that it illustrates, with unusual clarity, how the historical record is made. Not from systematic observation and careful documentation, but from accidents and fragments and the partial attention of people who were doing other things when history happened around them. The farmer was improving his field. The minister was visiting a parishioner. Cordner was traveling and writing letters. The local historian was compiling a survey. None of them was there for the mound. None of them was equipped to study it properly. None of them had the conceptual vocabulary that would only exist after another century of archaeological development. And yet what they left behind is not nothing. It is a record, incomplete and frustrating and full of gaps, but a record. A record that tells us a mound was opened, a chamber was found, objects were inside that puzzled educated observers, and those objects disappeared into private hands and have not been seen since. This record exists because these people bothered to write things down, because they were curious enough, or proud enough, or worried enough that future readers might question them, to set their observations on paper and send them to other people who kept them, because the paper survived, because enough of the chain of transmission held together to deliver these accounts into our hands. What did not survive is everything that was not written down. The farmer's experience of opening the mound, the sense of what it felt like to break into that darkness and find those things waiting in the silence, the conversations in the local community about what it meant, the memories of older people who might have known more about what the mound had been and why the warning about it had persisted, the objects themselves. This is how history works. And it is also how history fails. The record is not neutral. It preserves what literate, educated people chose to write down and what the accidents of survival allowed to persist. Everything else is silence. But the silence around the 1,774 mound is a particular kind of silence. It is not the silence of something that never happened. It is the silence of something that happened and was not adequately recorded and has been waiting in the gaps of the archive to be noticed. The northeast of Scotland is a different place from what it was in 1774. The fields have been improved and re-improved. The landscape has been transformed by agriculture, by drainage, by roads, by buildings. The standing stones that remain are protected now, fenced off and signposted, brought within the frame of heritage and tourism. The souterrains are excavated, at least the ones that have been found, and their contents are in museums. But the landscape still carries its layers. The Bronze Age ring cairns are still there, grass-covered and ancient, in fields that have been farmed for 3,000 years since they were built. The recumbent stone circles stand in their particular orientations, facing their particular angles of the sky, silent about what those orientations meant to the people who set them. The Pictish stones in the local churches and museums still carry their symbols, still face our attempts to read them with the same inscrutable surface. And somewhere under that improved and re-improved landscape, there are mounds that were not opened in 1774, that were not levelled in the agricultural improvement period, that are still waiting. Some of them probably contain nothing more dramatic than old bones and a few ordinary objects. But some of them, given the pattern we have been tracing, might contain something else. Something that an 18th century observer would have struggled to place in any known category. Something that would be immediately subjected to the full battery of modern analytical techniques if it were found today, and that might yield answers that the 1774 discovery was too poorly documented to provide. Modern archaeology has tools that were not available to the farmer and the minister and the antiquarian of 1774. Ground-penetrating radar can detect buried chambers without excavating them. Portable X-ray fluorescence can analyze the chemical composition of metal objects without destroying them. Carbon dating with precision that would have seemed like magic 2 centuries ago can tell you when a piece of organic material was last in contact with the living world. DNA analysis of fragmentary bone can place a person in a genetic context, can tell you something about where their ancestors came from. These tools are being applied to Scottish archaeology, and they are generating results that are steadily filling in the picture. The ancient DNA revolution is transforming what we know about population movements and genetic histories in prehistoric and early historic Britain. New LiDAR surveys of the Scottish landscape are revealing the full extent of ancient field systems, settlement patterns, and monuments that were invisible at ground level. Chemical analysis of finds from established sites is revealing trade connections and material sources that were previously unknown. None of this work has focused specifically on the 1774 mound, which is a known site without the institutional momentum to attract major investigation. But the general direction of Scottish archaeological research is toward a more complex, more internationally connected picture of early medieval Pictland than previous generations of scholarship allowed. And in that increasingly complex picture, a sealed chamber in the northeast of Scotland, with an unusual metal object that puzzled an 18th century antiquarian, looks less like an inexplicable anomaly and more like a data point at the edge of a pattern that is gradually becoming visible. In the autumn of 1774, when that farmer drove his spade into the seal's stain knowe, he was participating in one of the oldest and most fundamental of human activities. He was disrupting a deliberate arrangement of the world that other humans had made, a long time before him, for reasons he did not understand. The people who sealed that chamber had their reasons. They placed the objects inside with care. They built the chamber walls with craft. They laid the capstone with precision. They walked away, and they did not come back, and they passed down a warning that lasted for centuries without explanation, just the bare fact of it. Do not open this. The farmer opened it anyway. And what came out was not a curse, not a supernatural retribution, not any of the things that the old warnings implied. What came out was questions. Questions that 800 years had not resolved, that the chamber had held in suspension in the dark, and that the light of a late 18th century afternoon released into a world that was not yet equipped to answer them. The questions are still in the air, still moving through the scholarly literature and the popular imagination, still attaching themselves to new findings, new methods, new ways of asking what the past was like. The Picts are still a mystery. The North Atlantic is still yielding surprises about who crossed it and when. The pre-Columbian Americas are still being reassessed with every new study that challenges the assumptions of the isolation model. And the sealed chamber that sat under a field in Aberdeenshire for 1,000 years is still doing what it was made to do. Just not in the way the people who sealed it intended. Not containing something in darkness, opening something into light, opening the possibility that the world was more connected, more complex, more alive with contact and exchange and movement than the simplified narratives of history have allowed us to see. The maker of marks is gone. The symbols are carved in stone elsewhere, still unread, still waiting. But the question that the mound was sealed around is still asking itself, in every gap and every anomaly and everything that does not fit the categories we have been given. Who put it there? What was it? Where did it come from? What did it mean? We do not know. We may never know. And that not knowing is itself a kind of knowledge. A reminder that the past is not finished, that the archive is never complete, that the things we most need to understand are often the things that have left us the least to work with. The seal stain no is gone, but the seal is not closed. There is something profound about the way communities protect their mysteries. Not through formal institutions, not through written records, not through anything as fragile and specific as documentation, but through the simple repetition of a warning, passed from parent to child across generation after generation, gradually losing its specific content, but retaining its essential shape. Do not open this. Something is in there. Leave it alone. For perhaps 1,000 years, the community around the seal stain no preserved that warning. The specific knowledge of what was inside, of who had put it there and why, of what the symbols meant and what the objects were for, all of that was lost. But the warning survived. The bare instruction, do not disturb, outlasted everything else. Why? What mechanism keeps a warning alive across a millennium without any of the institutional supports that we normally associate with the preservation of knowledge? The answer is probably that the warning served a social function for the community that maintained it. Communities have many reasons to preserve certain spaces as forbidden or protected. It keeps the peace. It reserves a portion of the landscape from the pressures of use and exploitation. It creates a shared reference point for collective identity, a place that everyone knows about and that marks the landscape with significance. The specific content of the prohibition may become vague over time, but the prohibition itself remains because it is doing social work that has nothing to do with the original reason for it. In a sense, the warning was the most durable artifact of the chamber's original purpose, more durable than the chamber itself, which eventually succumbed to a farmer's practicality, more durable than the objects inside, which passed into private hands and disappeared. The warning outlasted everything else. And then in 1774, it too was broken. The seal was opened, the objects were handled and distributed and lost, and the long chain of oral transmission was snapped at the point where it should have finally yielded its meaning. That is the cruelest irony of the 1774 discovery. The warning survived 1,000 years, only to be overridden at precisely the moment when it might finally have been possible to ask the right questions. Another 100 years, and there would have been trained archaeologists. Another 100, and there would have been carbon dating and chemical analysis. Another 100 still, and there would have been ancient DNA studies and portable spectroscopy and LiDAR surveys. The farmer's spade went in 1774. Too late for anyone with the old knowledge to be present and explain. Too early for anyone with the new tools to study what was found. The 1774 discovery fell into the gap between two worlds of understanding, and it fell into that gap completely, taking most of what it could have told us with it. All we have are the descriptions, and they are enough to tell us that something was there, something unusual, something that puzzled the people who found it and that they could not explain, something that was sealed away from the world for a reason, by people who believed the sealing mattered, and that the farmer opened without knowing he was cutting the last thread of a connection that had been maintained for 10 centuries without being understood. If you are still with me, in the small hours, if this voice has been carrying you through the dark towards sleep, while the details of the Pictish Mound and the sealed chamber and the strange objects have been settling somewhere in your mind, let me bring you back, gently, to where we started. A farmer, a mound, a spade. An autumn afternoon in 1774. The farmer did not know what he was opening. He probably never did. He levelled his field and got on with his work, and the objects found their way to a gentleman's collection and then into silence, and the questions they raised floated up into the Scottish air and began their long, unresolved circulation through the margins of history. The Picts are still there in the margins of our understanding. Their stones are still standing in the churchyards and fields of the northeast of Scotland. Their symbols are still unread. Their language is still sealed. Their culture is still only partially visible, seen through the narrow apertures of what the earth has chosen to keep and what the historical record chose to record. But they were real. They were a civilization. They were people who built things with care and carved things with beauty and buried their dead with intention and sealed their chambers for reasons that mattered to them and that we have not yet been able to reconstruct. The North Atlantic that surrounded their world was not an impassable barrier. It was a sea that people crossed, in small boats, and with great courage, long before Columbus gave Europeans a fixed reference point for thinking about the ocean to the west. What moved across that sea, in both directions, in the centuries when the Picts were carving their symbols and sealing their mounds, is a question that is still being asked, and that is beginning, slowly, to yield answers. Not the specific answer to what was in the 1774 mound. That answer is probably gone. But the larger answer to what kind of world the Picts inhabited, how connected that world was, how far the lines of contact and exchange and movement extended, that answer is slowly being assembled from many sources. And the sealed mound in Aberdeenshire, the seal stain No, is part of it. One data point among many, one anomaly in a record full of anomalies. One door that was opened at the wrong time, by the wrong person, without the right tools, and that has been open ever since. The Picts kept their secrets well. They sealed their chambers and they carved their symbols and they used a language that left almost no trace, and they maintained a visual tradition whose meaning they took with them into the earth. They were, in a sense, the most successful keepers of secrets in early medieval Europe. But secrets do not last forever. The earth gives things up eventually. The record yields, slowly and partially, to the persistence of inquiry. The symbols that cannot be read now may be readable in 50 years when new methods and new comparative material become available. The mounds that have not been excavated professionally may someday be examined with ground-penetrating radar and ancient DNA analysis and all the other tools that the future will develop and we cannot yet imagine. And somewhere in that process, the thing that the farmer opened in 1774 and did not understand will find its context, will be placed in the wider pattern, will be recognized as part of something larger than a single puzzling find on a single Scottish farm. Until then, the mystery is the point. The mystery keeps the inquiry alive. The mystery is what sits in the sealed chamber of our understanding, waiting for the right spade to open it. Sleep well. And if you wake in the middle of the night, as you might, as the old biphasic sleep pattern that our Paleolithic ancestors maintained occasionally surfaces in modern humans who are resting deeply, if you wake, and the question surfaces with you, which one of those objects was it that the antiquarian could not place in any European tradition? Do not worry. The question will be there in the morning. The mound has been sealed again, in a different way, for now. The makers of marks are patient. They have been waiting for 1,000 years already. They can wait a little longer. There is one more thread to pull, one more direction in which the mystery of the 1,774 mound extends outward, and it is perhaps the most speculative but also the most compelling. It concerns the question of who built the mound, not who was buried in it, but who constructed the chamber, who placed the capstone, who sealed it. The sealing of a mound with such care and precision implies organization. It implies someone with the authority to say this will be done, and people with the skill to do it, and a community that accepted the purpose of the act. In the early medieval world, acts of this kind were not undertaken by individuals acting alone. They were community rituals, performed by groups for purposes that the entire community understood, or at least accepted. The community that sealed the 1,774 mound was probably the same community that carved the nearby symbol stones. That made the silverwork in the tradition of the Pictish hordes. That maintained the knowledge of what the symbols meant and what the sealing of the mound was intended to accomplish. This community is largely invisible to us. We see their monuments, we see their art, we see the external traces of their cultural activity. But the inner life of the community, the social structures, the belief systems, the ritual traditions, the mechanisms by which knowledge was transmitted and authority was exercised, all of that is hidden. But we can make some inferences from what we know about early medieval communities in the Celtic world more broadly. Communities that maintained elaborate ritual traditions typically had specialists who held the knowledge of those traditions. In the Celtic world, these specialists went by various names: druid, ovate, bard, fillid, depending on the tradition and the period. What they shared was a position of custodial authority over the community's accumulated knowledge, expressed through memorization, through ritual practice, through the maintenance of symbolic systems. If the Picts had equivalents of these specialists, and the elaborateness of their symbol tradition strongly suggests they did, then the sealing of the 1774 mound was probably the work of exactly these people. The specialists who knew what the symbols meant, the keepers of the tradition, the ones who decided what objects should accompany this particular person into the earth and how the chamber should be built and sealed. And the objects they chose, carved stones with symbols, a figured metal plate in an unusual style, a ceramic vessel with organic contents. These were choices made by people who understood the full system, people who knew exactly what they were doing and why. The tragedy, if that is the right word, is that these people's understanding was sealed into the earth along with everything else. The specialists who sealed the chamber carried the key to its interpretation. They taught their successors, for a generation or two perhaps, and then the tradition weakened or was suppressed or simply could not be sustained in the face of the changes that overtook Pictish society in the 9th century, and the key was lost. What remained was the warning, the bare community memory that this mound contained something that mattered and should not be disturbed. The warning outlasted the knowledge by centuries. And then 1774, and the spade, and the questions that have been asking themselves ever since. I will tell you what I believe, not as a scholar making a definitive claim, but as someone who has spent a long time looking at this mystery from many angles. I believe the 1774 mound was a deliberate and high-status Pictish burial, sealed sometime between the 7th and 9th centuries AD. I believe the person buried there was someone of significant importance in the Pictish ritual or political world, someone whose identity and possessions were considered important enough to warrant the elaborate construction of a sealed chamber. I believe the objects placed in the chamber were chosen deliberately from among things that this person had possessed or that were associated with their identity and role in the community. And I believe that among those objects was at least one, the metal plate with its figured designs, that had arrived in Pictland from somewhere outside the known European trading sphere. Where exactly it came from, I cannot say. The 18th century accounts are too fragmentary to pin this down, but the consistency of the observation, that it did not fit any known European tradition, suggests that the description was accurate, even if the interpretation remains uncertain. Where it came from is the question I cannot answer, but the most interesting answers to that question are not the comfortable ones. They are the ones that extend the Pictish world's connections in directions that challenge the simplified maps of the early medieval world that we have been taught to use. The world was larger and more connected than the standard narratives have allowed. The North Atlantic was crossed more often and by more kinds of people than the history books have recorded. The Picts were part of a wider world, and that wider world left traces in their mounds and their metalwork and their symbols that we have not fully read. The 1774 mound is a small window into something much larger. The window was opened too early to be used properly, and then it was let go, and the objects disappeared, and the window clouded over. But the light that came through it for those brief years of partial documentation is still there, still asking to be looked at, still pointing towards something that has not been fully seen. The farmer drove his spade into the seal stain No in 1774, and the seal was broken, and the questions came out, and they are still moving through the world 2.5 centuries later, looking for the context that will finally let them come to rest. The Picts are still making us look. They were always good at that. We have come a long way tonight. From a field in Aberdeenshire and a farmer with a spade, to the undeciphered symbols on standing stones, and the unresolved mystery of a people who fought Rome and produced extraordinary art, and then vanished from the historical record in ways that have never been fully explained. From the sealed chamber and its puzzling contents to the wider question of the North Atlantic world and who was crossing it and why and what they were carrying. From the fragments of 18th century accounts to the larger question of how history is made and what it misses and what persists in the gaps. This is what the best mysteries do. They do not stay where you find them. They open outward, into everything connected to them, into the wider world of questions that surround every specific puzzle. The 1774 mound is not just a strange discovery, it is a door into the whole complicated, incompletely understood world of the Picts and their connections and their end. And the Picts are not just a Scottish curiosity, they are a question about the early medieval world, about how civilizations were connected before the age of documentation, about what moved across the seas that separated the continents, about what the Atlantic was before anyone wrote down what they found on its far shore. The farmer did not know he was opening a door into all of this. He was just trying to flat his field. But the mound had been waiting. For 1,000 years, it had been holding its questions in the dark, sealed against the world, patient with the patience of the long-buried. And when the spade finally broke through, those questions came out into the Scottish afternoon, and they have been moving ever since. The last chapter of the seal's stain, no, has not been written. The objects that came out of it are somewhere, or they are nowhere, lost in the long accumulation of time and private collection and the accidents that determine what survives and what does not. But the pattern they were part of is gradually becoming visible in new excavations and new analytical methods, a new willingness to ask uncomfortable questions about the early medieval world. Somewhere in that pattern, the thing that puzzled Cordner will eventually find its place, will be recognized and classified and understood, will yield the information that it has been holding since a craftsperson made it in a tradition and a place that we have not yet identified, and it travelled, by routes we have not yet traced, to end up in a chamber under a field in Aberdeenshire, where it was sealed for 1,000 years until a farmer and his spade opened the dark. Until then, the mystery is in the air, circulating, patient. The Picts keep their secrets well. But the world is getting better at asking the right questions. The seal's stain no is waiting, and so are we. If you have been with me all the way to the end of this journey, thank you. These are the kinds of stories I love most. Not the ones with clean conclusions and tidy answers, but the ones that leave you at the edge of something vast and incompletely charted, with the sense that the horizon is further away than you thought, and the map is less complete than you had been told. The Picts are one of history's great mysteries. The 1,774 mound is one small and poorly documented piece of that mystery. But it is a piece that opens outward, into the North Atlantic and the pre-Columbian Americas, and the whole complicated question of how connected the early medieval world was, and how much of that connection has been lost. If you found this journey worthwhile, consider subscribing, and share it with someone who loves history that does not fit inside the neat categories. Let me know in the comments where in the world you are listening from, and what time it is, and whether you are drifting towards sleep or wide awake with questions. The questions are worth keeping. They are the best thing that came out of the seal stain no when the farmer opened it in 1774, better than anything that has since been lost. The questions are still alive, still circulating, still asking to be asked. Good night. The marks are still doing what they were made to do. Let us return to the symbols themselves, because they deserve more time than we have given them. The Pictish symbol system is, when you spend enough time looking at it, one of the most haunting and compelling artistic traditions in the entire history of human visual expression. It is not that the individual symbols are uniquely beautiful, though many of them are. It is the combination of precision, repetition, and total interpretive resistance that makes them so extraordinary. You look at a crescent and V-rod and you know, at some level you cannot fully articulate, that it means something. It is obviously not decorative in a casual sense. It has weight, it has intention, but the meaning is sealed from you as completely as the chamber in the Aberdeenshire field was sealed from the farmer, and the parallel is not accidental. The Pictish symbol system is a sealed language. Not sealed in stone, exactly, because the stone has opened and the symbols are visible to anyone who goes to look, but sealed in meaning, in the sense that the key that would open it to interpretation has been lost for 1,000 years and has not been recovered. Some of the most compelling work on the symbols has been done by researchers who have taken a quantitative approach to the problem, counting the occurrences of each symbol, mapping which symbols appear together, building a statistical picture of the grammar of the system, even in the absence of any ability to read the vocabulary. This work has produced some interesting findings. The symbols appear in pairs, not always but very frequently, and the pairs are not random. Certain symbols appear together more often than chance would predict. Certain symbols never appear together. The crescent and the double disc are the two most common symbols in the system, and they appear together with significant frequency, but always in a specific relationship to each other on the stone, never randomly arranged. This grammar suggests two possibilities. Either the symbols represent a genuine writing system, in which the combinations are like words or phrases in a language, or they represent a coding system for some other kind of information, astronomical data, genealogical data, territorial data, in which the combinations encode the relationship between two pieces of information. The astronomical hypothesis is one that has attracted sustained scholarly attention. The positions and combinations of Pictish symbols on stones have been analyzed against the movements of celestial bodies, against the solar and lunar calendar, against the positions of stars visible from Scotland. Some researchers have found correlations that they regard as significant. Others have found the correlations unconvincing. The debate has not been resolved. But the astronomical hypothesis has a particular appeal in the context of the 1774 mound. Because if the symbols encoded astronomical or calendrical information, then placing them in a burial chamber takes on a specific meaning. You are not simply labeling the dead person or marking their identity. You are placing them within a cosmic framework, orienting their burial within the movements of the sky. This practice is well documented across many ancient and early medieval cultures. The alignment of burial chambers with solstice, sunrise, or sunset, the placement of certain kinds of grave goods that have astronomical associations, the use of symbolic systems that encode sky knowledge in burial contexts. All of these practices reflect a belief that the dead person's journey or condition after death was linked to the movements of the cosmos, and that the proper performance of burial required acknowledging and encoding that link. If the Pictish symbols had this kind of cosmic dimension, then the sealed chamber with its carved symbol stones was not simply a container for a body and some objects. It was a cosmological statement, a precise arrangement of meaning that placed the dead person in a specific relationship to the universe as the Picts understood it. And the other objects in the chamber, the metal plate, the ceramic vessel, might have been part of the same cosmological statement. Not grave goods in the ordinary sense of things the dead person would need or had valued in life, but elements of a ritual arrangement that had to be complete and precise for the burial to accomplish whatever it was intended to accomplish. This is speculative. Everything about the interior life of Pictish ritual is speculative, but it gives a framework in which the unusual nature of the objects in the 1774 mound makes a different kind of sense. If the arrangement was cosmological rather than personal, then the specific identity of the objects mattered less than their place in the cosmic scheme. And a metal plate from a distant tradition might have been chosen precisely because of its associations with a distant place or a distant people, because in the cosmological vocabulary of the Pictish burial tradition, a distant origin carried its own kind of meaning. Let us spend some time with the ocean itself, because the North Atlantic is not simply a geographical fact. It is a presence, a force, a dimension of the world that shaped every culture that lived near it in ways both practical and cosmological. For the peoples of the Atlantic fringe of Europe, the ocean was not the edge of the world, it was a direction. It was the West, and in many of the traditions that came out of the Atlantic Celtic world, the West had specific cosmological associations. The land of the dead was to the west, the other world was to the west. The islands of the blessed, the places where heroes went after death, were out in the Western Ocean, beyond the visible horizon. The Irish tradition calls this place Tir na Nog, the land of youth. The Welsh tradition calls it Annwn, the underworld that was also an elsewhere, accessible through certain liminal places and certain liminal times. The Arthurian tradition's Avalon is an island to the west, where the dying king is taken to heal or to wait. All of these traditions share the sense that the Western Ocean is not simply water and weather, but a passage, a threshold, a direction in which important things lie. This is not merely mythological decoration. It reflects the maritime experience of peoples who lived on the edge of the Atlantic and who, looking westward, could feel the pull of the unknown beyond the horizon. They knew the ocean was crossable because they crossed it, in both directions, in their hide boats and their currachs and their wooden ships, and they also knew that what lay beyond their knowledge of it was genuine mystery, genuinely unknown, genuinely other. The West was the direction of death in these traditions, not because death is frightening, but because the unknown horizon is the natural metaphor for the transition from the known to the unknown, from the world of the living to whatever follows. And for cultures with real knowledge of what lay to the West, cultures whose monks and sailors were regularly crossing the North Atlantic in the first millennium AD, the mythological West was not purely metaphorical. It was anchored in real experience of a real ocean with real lands beyond it. In this context, an object from somewhere to the west, wherever exactly it came from, arriving in Pictland and being placed in a high-status burial chamber, might have carried a specific cosmological weight, not simply as an exotic trade object, but as something from the direction of the otherworld, something that had crossed the threshold. The people who sealed the 1774 chamber did not leave us a note explaining their reasoning. We cannot know whether they thought of the unusual metal plate in this way. But we can note that the tradition in which they were working, the Celtic Atlantic tradition with its specific cosmological geography, would have given them a framework in which an object from the west carried that kind of meaning. And we can note that the chamber was sealed, not simply buried, not simply covered over, but deliberately and carefully sealed, as if what was inside needed to be contained or preserved or maintained in a specific state. Sealed chambers have specific associations in the ritual traditions of many cultures. They are places where something is being kept, not lost, where the contents are still, in some sense, active. The marks inside the mounds were still doing what they were made to do. The 18th century oral tradition remembered this, even if it did not remember what the marks were made to do. Whatever was in the 1774 chamber was placed there to do something. The chamber was sealed to allow it to do that something undisturbed. The warning maintained by the community for centuries was a form of respect for whatever was happening inside. When the farmer opened the seal in 1774, he did not know he was interrupting something. He was just clearing his field. But the community memory that he overrode had been correct about one thing. The mound was not simply a pile of earth with some bones in it. It was something more, something that the people who built it had intended to last, had intended to function, had intended to be left alone. The function, whatever it was, is as sealed from us now as the chamber was sealed from the afternoon air before the spade broke through. But the intention is still legible, in the quality of the stonework and the care of the sealing and the long persistence of the community warning. These were people who meant what they did. We must also talk about what happened in Scotland in the centuries just before the mound was sealed, because the context of Pictish history in the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries is a context of extraordinary turbulence and transformation, and understanding that context helps explain why the sealing of the chamber might have been an act with urgency behind it. The 7th century in Scotland saw the intensification of the conflict between the Picts and the Anglian kingdom of Northumbria to the south. The Northumbrians were expanding northward with military force and cultural ambition, bringing with them Christianity in its Roman form, the political structures of a more centralized kingdom, and the literary and artistic traditions of the Anglo-Saxon world. The Picts resisted. The Battle of Nectansmere in 685 AD was one of the decisive events of early medieval Britain. The Pictish king Bride mac Billy led his forces against the Northumbrian king Ecgfrith, who had pushed into Pictish territory with a large army. The battle ended in a complete Northumbrian defeat. Ecgfrith was killed. His army was destroyed. The Northumbrian expansion into Pictland was permanently checked. This was not just a military victory. It was a cultural assertion. Pictland remained Pictish. The Anglian linguistic and cultural influence, which had been making significant inroads, was rolled back. The Pictish symbol tradition continued and, if anything, intensified in the late 7th and 8th centuries. Some of the most elaborate and accomplished Pictish stone carvings date to this period. But the threat had not gone away. Northumbria remained a significant military force. The Norse began raiding in the late 8th century, striking the Scottish coast and the islands with devastating effect. The monastery at Iona was sacked in 795, 802, and 806. The wider network of early medieval Christian culture in Scotland was under sustained and violent pressure. In this context, the sealing of significant objects in buried chambers takes on a specific urgency. It is the same impulse that produced the silver hoards, the extraordinary collections of Pictish metalwork buried in the ground in the late 8th and 9th centuries, presumably in response to Norse raids and never recovered by their original owners. The impulse to protect what was valuable by putting it underground, out of reach of those who would destroy or dispossess. But the 1774 chamber was different from the silver hoards in one important respect. The silver hoards were hidden with the expectation of recovery. Someone buried them hoping to come back and retrieve them, and either died in the meantime or was prevented from returning by circumstances we can only guess at. The 1774 chamber was sealed with permanence in mind. It was not hidden for later retrieval, it was built to last. The craftsmanship of the stonework, the care of the ceiling, the deliberateness of the structure all point toward a burial that was intended to be final. This suggests that what was placed in the chamber was not simply being hidden, it was being interred. The distinction matters. Hiding something implies you want it back eventually. Burying something implies you are giving it to the earth permanently. What would make people bury something permanently, with such care and such ceremony, in a context of cultural threat and military pressure? The answer that the context suggests is that they were burying what they most needed to protect from the world that was changing around them. Not simply valuable objects, but things that carried the identity and the knowledge of their community, things that should not fall into the hands of those who would not understand or who would destroy what they could not use. The symbols were carved onto stone in public, on standing stones that anyone could see. But the specific meaning of the symbols, the knowledge that unlocked the system, was not carved onto public stones. That knowledge lived in the minds of the keepers of the tradition. And when those keepers felt the tradition was genuinely threatened, when they could see that the world was changing in ways that might prevent the next generation from learning what they knew, sealing that knowledge in the earth alongside the symbolic objects that expressed it would have been a final, desperate act of preservation. Not preservation for recovery. Preservation as an act of respect, as a way of saying, this mattered, we kept it as well as we could. We give it to the earth because we cannot guarantee it to the world. The 1774 mound might be the grave of the last keeper of a tradition that was sealing itself away, the last holder of the key to the symbols, taking the key into the earth because there was no one left who could hold it. This is not a certain interpretation, it is a reading of the evidence, a story that fits the facts without being proven by them. But it is a story that has the quality of truth in it, the ring of something that could have happened, that would explain the particular combination of elaborateness and finality that the accounts suggest. The makers of marks knew their time was ending, and they sealed their last mark in the earth, in the dark, under a hill that the community was told to leave alone forever. The question of what makes a culture visible to history is one that deserves more attention than it usually gets. We tend to think of the historical record as a more or less faithful, if incomplete, reflection of what happened in the past. But the historical record is an artifact of specific conditions of literacy, documentation, and survival. It reflects not simply what happened, but what happened to people who wrote things down, or whose activities were observed by people who wrote things down, and whose documents survived the many accidents and disasters that destroy most paper and parchment over centuries. The Picts were not fully literate in the sense of having a robust written documentary tradition. They had the Ogham script, used for some purposes. They may have had Latin literacy in their monasteries, because the early medieval church in Scotland was connected to the wider literate world of the Christian church. But the kind of extensive documentary tradition that survives for, say, Anglo-Saxon England, the legal codes and chronicles and letters and homilies that give us dense knowledge of how that society worked, does not exist for Pictland. This means that the Picts are visible primarily through their material culture, their art, their objects, their buildings, and through the references to them in documents written by their neighbours and enemies. Both of these windows are narrow. The material culture is fragmentary, surviving from the accidents of archaeological discovery. The documentary references are few and written from outside, by people with their own perspectives and agendas. The result is a civilization that is known primarily through its surface. The symbols on the stones, the quality of the silverwork, the location and alignment of the monuments, the pattern of place names in the landscape, the genetic profile of the population that descended from them. These are all real kinds of knowledge, but they are indirect. They tell you what the Picts made and where they lived and how they moved through the landscape, but they do not tell you what they thought or believed or valued or feared in their own words and from their own perspective. Every culture has an inner life that is inaccessible from outside. The documents, if they exist, let you in a little way, through the perspectives of the people who wrote them. The material culture lets you in a different way, through the choices that people made about what to make and how to make it and where to put it. But the full complexity of a culture, the jokes and the arguments and the doubts and the moments of private experience that make up most of any human life, that is never recoverable. It is lost with the people who lived it. For the Picts, even the documentary window is barely ajar. What we have is the material culture and the external references. And when the material culture includes objects that do not fit any known category, objects described by observers in terms that reach beyond all their reference points, those objects become the most interesting and the most frustrating kind of evidence. They are windows into something that cannot be fully seen. The metal plate from the 1774 mound was that kind of evidence, a window into something that neither the farmer nor the minister nor cordner could see fully, a thing from somewhere that was not the known world of 18th century European antiquarian scholarship, and because it was not properly studied and eventually disappeared, the window closed again, and the something behind it remains unseen. Here is a thought experiment that sometimes helps to make the abstract concrete. Imagine you are one of the people who sealed the 1774 chamber. Not the person who was buried there, but one of the people who attended the burial, who helped build the chamber, who placed the objects and laid the capstone. You are standing in the Aberdeenshire landscape sometime in the 7th, 8th, or 9th century. The hills around you are the same hills that a farmer would see 1,000 years later. The sky above you is the same sky. The wind from the sea carries the same smell of salt and weather that it carries now. The language you speak is not a language that anyone standing near you in the 20th century would understand. You are doing something important. You can feel the weight of it. The person who has died was someone whose knowledge and authority shaped the community you live in. You may have learned things from them that you will spend the rest of your life trying to use well. You may have depended on them in ways you did not fully realize until they were gone. You are placing into the earth the objects that defined them, the stones with the symbols that carried their authority and their knowledge, the metal plate that came from somewhere far away, that they received as a gift or a trade, that they kept because it meant something specific in the scheme of things they understood, and you are still learning. The ceramic vessel with whatever is inside it, a residue of something that was part of the ritual tradition, something that has been sealed in there for the ceremony of burial and will stay sealed now, going into the earth with everything else. You lay the capstone. It is heavy. It takes several of you to lift it into place. When it settles, there is a sound, a particular sound of stone on stone meeting in a specific way that you know means the chamber is closed. The darkness under the stone is complete and permanent. You walk away. You do not come back. The community comes back later to build up the mound, to mark the place, to establish the memorial that will become the seal stain no. And then you pass on the warning. Not forever. You have no way to know it will last forever. Just to the next people. Do not open this. Something is in there. Leave it alone. And they pass it on. And they pass it on. And they pass it on. For 1,000 years. Until 1774. This is the human chain that connected the ceiling to the opening. A chain of people, most of them unknown and unknowable, who maintained a tradition they did not fully understand because their parents had told them to, and their parents had told them, all the way back to a hillside in the early medieval period, where a community of Pictish people was placing their dead and their knowledge and their connections into the earth. The chain is broken now. The knowledge that was transmitted has been gone for centuries, but the warning, and then the opening, and then the inadequate accounts, and then the silence, and then this story, 2.5 centuries later, still tracing the shape of what was there, still trying to follow the thread back to its source. We are the next link in the chain, not the keepers of the original knowledge, which is irrecoverable, but the keepers of the question, the people who refuse to let the mystery close down into comfortable ignorance, who keep asking, who keep looking, who keep being troubled by the things that do not fit the standard accounts. The Picts made us look. They are still making us look. That may be the most enduring thing about them. Not the symbols, which we cannot read, not the language, which is lost, but the quality of their mystery, which keeps generating inquiry and refusing to be satisfied. We have been in this mound for a long time tonight. We have followed the questions it opened in 1774 through the Pictish symbol tradition and the North Atlantic and the pre-Columbian Americas, and the forbidden history that has been slowly becoming less forbidden as new tools, and new questions emerge. We have tried to understand the people who built the chamber and the people who opened it and the long human chain between them. Let me bring it back, one more time, to the simplest version of what we know. In 1774, a farmer opened a sealed mound in Aberdeenshire, Scotland. Inside was a stone chamber that had been sealed for perhaps 1,000 years. Inside the chamber were bones, carved stones with Pictish symbols, a metal plate with figured designs that an 18th-century antiquarian could not place in any European tradition, and a ceramic vessel that broke apart on exposure to air. The objects were handled inadequately, distributed into private hands, and have not been traced since. Two partial accounts of the discovery survive. A small excavation in 1993 confirmed the existence of the chamber and produced a fragment of bronze with unusual chemical composition, but found nothing more specific. The site is now a level agricultural field with no visible marker. That is what we know. The rest is interpretation, inference, hypothesis, and speculation. The speculation ranges from very grounded to quite wild, and I have tried to indicate throughout where on that spectrum each thought falls. But here is what I am confident of, even at the end of all of this. The 1774 discovery was not simply an ordinary Pictish burial with slightly unusual grave goods. The combination of elements, the quality of the chamber construction, the specific nature of the objects as described, the community tradition of prohibition, the 18th-century antiquarian's inability to place the figured metalwork in any known tradition, these things add up to something that sits outside the ordinary pattern. What that something was, I cannot tell you. I can tell you it is interesting. I can tell you it deserves more serious attention than it has received. I can tell you that, in the context of what we now know about the early medieval North Atlantic, and what we are still learning about pre-Columbian contacts and connections, the mystery of the 1774 mound points in directions that are genuinely worth following. And I can tell you that the symbols on the Pictish stones are still unread, still waiting for the key that was sealed into the earth with the last keeper of the tradition, still carved into the stone faces of standing monuments across the northeast of Scotland, facing the weather and the centuries and the patient inquiry of people who refuse to stop asking what they mean. The Picts were the makers of marks. The marks are still there. We just cannot read them yet. But we are getting better at looking. One last thing before you sleep. There is a standing stone in Aberdeenshire, not far from where the seal stain no once stood. It is carved with two symbols, a crescent and V-rod, a double disc and Z-rod, the most common pairing in the Pictish repertoire. The stone has been standing in that field for perhaps 1400 years. It has seen the early medieval period and the Viking Age and the medieval period, and the agricultural improvements of the 18th century and the Industrial Revolution and 2 world wars and the digital age. It has seen all of these things without changing. The symbols are a little weathered, a little harder to read in certain lights, but still clearly there. No one has ever been able to say with certainty what the crescent and V-rod means. No one has ever been able to say with certainty what the double disc and Z-rod means. The pairing of the two has generated dozens of scholarly hypotheses, none of which has convinced everyone. The stone does not care. The stone is patient in the way that only very old and very silent things can be patient. It has been asking its question for 14 centuries, in a language that the modern world cannot read, in the landscape where the Picts lived and made their marks, and buried their dead and sealed their chambers, and eventually disappeared into the long process of history. If you stand near the stone in the late afternoon, when the light is coming from the west and the shadows of the carved lines are at their deepest, the symbols seem to be on the edge of meaning. Not quite meaning, but on the edge of it, like a word in a language you almost know, hovering at the boundary of comprehension. The Picts were always on the edge of being understood. They carved their language in stone and made their most important objects beautiful and buried their most important people with ceremony and care. They did everything that a culture does when it wants to be remembered. They just did it in a way that we have not yet learned to read. The mound in 1774 was one more attempt to communicate across time, not a message in language, not words in stone, but a carefully arranged set of objects, placed in darkness with intention and sealed against the world for as long as the seal would hold. The seal held for 1,000 years. The message got out in 1774, and we have been trying to read it ever since. Keep trying. The makers of marks would want us to. Sleep well. The symbols are watching over this part of the world in their patient, unreadable way. Whatever they mean, they have been meaning it for a very long time. That is more permanence than almost anything else in the world can claim. Good night. There is a piece of the story we have not told yet, and it is perhaps the most concrete piece we have, even though it is also the most contested. It concerns a series of objects in various museum collections across Scotland and England that have been tentatively associated with Pictish burial contexts and that have sparked quiet but sustained debate among specialists who study early medieval metalwork. The objects in question are small, personal scale, not the grand silverwork of the major Pictish hoards, but smaller pieces, pins and plaques, and ornamental fragments, whose style and material composition put them in an ambiguous category. They are clearly early medieval, they are clearly found in a Scottish context, or claim to be, but their style does not match cleanly with any established Pictish tradition, and some of them have chemical compositions that point toward origins outside Scotland, possibly outside Britain entirely. Most of these objects entered museum collections in the 19th century through exactly the same kind of process that produced the 1774 mound discovery, agricultural work that disturbed ancient deposits, private collection by local landowners or interested clergymen, eventual donation or sale to museum collections, without systematic excavation or proper documentation of find contexts. The result is a scatter of anomalous objects in museum drawers, noted in catalogues as Pictish or possible Pictish or provenance unknown Scotland, and never given the attention they might deserve because the attention of the field has been elsewhere. One of these objects, a small bronze plaque in a Scottish museum collection that entered the collection in 1847 with a note describing it as found near a mound in the northeast, has been the subject of two brief scholarly notices that drew attention to features of its decoration that do not match known Pictish or early medieval British styles. The decoration includes a figural element, a human or human-like form in a posture that one of the scholars described as characteristic of artistic traditions from outside Europe, without specifying which traditions. The note was not followed up, and the plaque sits in the museum's reserve collection, accessible to researchers but not routinely displayed. Could this object be related to what was in the 1774 mound? The connection is impossible to establish. The 1,774 objects, as we have seen, have not been traced to any museum collection. The note on this object says northeast, which is consistent with the 1,774 location, but northeast of Scotland covers a large area with many mounds and many opportunities for objects to enter museum collections through undocumented channels. What this object does is establish a category. It demonstrates that anomalous objects from Pictish contexts, objects that do not fit the known Pictish tradition, have made it into museum collections, even if inadequately documented. It suggests that the 1,774 mound was not unique in producing this kind of object. It was simply the best documented example of a pattern that may be scattered through the archaeological record in fragments too small and too poorly connected to be recognized as a pattern. This is exactly how anomalous patterns work in the historical record. They show up in individual instances, each one dismissed or set aside for lack of context. It is only when enough of the instances are brought together that the pattern becomes visible. And the process of bringing them together requires someone to look for them, which requires someone to believe they are worth looking for, which requires the willingness to take the anomalies seriously before you know whether they add up to anything. The 1,774 mound is an argument for taking the anomalies seriously. We should also talk about the soil, not in a romantic or metaphorical sense, but in the practical sense of what the soil of Aberdeenshire preserves and what it destroys, because that practical reality is part of why the 1,774 discovery is so incomplete and why similar discoveries have left such fragmentary records. Soil chemistry in the northeast of Scotland varies considerably across the landscape. Some soils are acidic and wet, and they destroy organic material rapidly. Bone, leather, wood, textiles, plant material, all of these are gone within decades in an acidic, wet environment. Other soils are more neutral and dry, and they can preserve organic material for centuries or even millennia under the right conditions. The 1,774 chamber was dry inside, which is why the minister commented on it. The seal had kept moisture out for centuries. In a dry environment, organic material can survive remarkably well. Textiles in sealed Egyptian tombs have lasted thousands of years. Wooden objects in the dry conditions of Scandinavian bogs have lasted centuries. The dry conditions inside the 1774 chamber would have been favorable to the preservation of the ceramic vessel and possibly of organic residues inside it. The vessel broke apart on exposure to air, which suggests it was preserved but fragile, exactly the kind of preservation you see with objects that have been stable in a sealed environment and then catastrophically destabilized when that environment changes. The dark residue inside it was noted by the minister, who could not identify it. Modern analytical chemistry could identify organic residues with remarkable precision, identifying not just the general category of material, but the specific plant or animal products involved. If that residue were available to modern analysis, it might tell us something significant about what the vessel had contained, and therefore what the burial ritual had involved. But the vessel is gone. The residue is gone. What remains is the description, a vessel of unfamiliar ceramic, containing a dark residue smelling of something organic. The ceramic itself is interesting. The minister says it was a clay or ceramic material he had not seen before. In the northeastern Scottish archaeological context, this is significant. The ceramic traditions of Pictish Scotland are not particularly elaborate or varied. There was local production of basic utilitarian pottery. There were imports from elsewhere in Britain and occasionally from further afield. A ceramic that a well-read 18th century minister had not seen before and could not categorize was unusual. The chemical analysis of the 1,993 fragments included, as mentioned, a piece of fired clay with characteristics that did not match local traditions. The analysis laboratory noted that the firing temperature and clay composition suggested a different production tradition without being able to specify which. This is consistent with the minister's observation that the ceramic was unfamiliar, and it is one more data point suggesting that at least some of what was in the chamber came from outside the normal sphere of Pictish material culture. Where did an unusual ceramic come from? Trade, gift exchange, the personal possessions of someone who had travelled or who had received things from someone who had travelled. A vessel made in a tradition that is not represented in the Scottish archaeological record is, by definition, a vessel from somewhere that we have not yet connected to Scotland through the known trade routes. This does not make it exotic in any dramatic sense. Continental European ceramics reached Scotland in the early medieval period. Mediterranean imports, including wine vessels, have been found at high-status early medieval Scottish sites. The range of possible origins for an unfamiliar ceramic found in a high-status Pictish burial is genuinely wide. But it is another thread in the pattern, another thing that points outward from the Pictish northeast toward connections that have not been fully mapped. I want to tell you about a man who spent 20 years of his life trying to read the Pictish symbols and who came closer than anyone before him, and who remains a controversial and fascinating figure in the history of the attempt. His name is not well known outside specialist circles, which is itself part of the story. He was not an academic archaeologist. He was a retired engineer with a passion for ancient Scotland and enough mathematical training to approach the symbols with a quantitative rigor that professional archaeologists of his generation did not typically apply to the problem. He spent 2 decades visiting every Pictish symbol stone he could find, photographing them, measuring the symbols, recording their combinations and relationships, building a database, by hand in the pre-computer era, that mapped the grammar of the symbol system with a comprehensiveness that had not been attempted before. And then he wrote a series of papers arguing that the symbols were a genuine writing system and that he had partially decoded it. His papers were received with skepticism. The mainstream archaeological establishment had reasons to be cautious about amateur codebreakers, for the same reasons we have discussed. The history of the field was full of people who had claimed to decode ancient mysteries and who had turned out to be imposing their own frameworks on the material rather than reading what was actually there. The professional caution was reasonable, but his work was not simply wishful thinking. He had done serious mathematical analysis of the symbol combinations. His database was real. His methodology, however controversial the conclusions, was more rigorous than what had come before. And some of his specific observations about which symbols pair with which and which combinations never occur have been confirmed by subsequent more formal analysis. The question of whether he actually decoded anything, whether the syllabic values he proposed for certain symbols have any relationship to the Pictish language, has not been resolved. His system could not be tested independently without a corpus of known Pictish texts to check it against, and no such corpus exists. He died in the 1990s, his decipherment unconfirmed and largely unknown outside a small circle of interested scholars and enthusiasts. His papers are held in a Scottish archive. His database was never digitized, and the physical records have not been fully preserved. Another sealed record, another repository of careful work that has not been given its full evaluation. What this man's story illustrates is how difficult it is to make progress on a genuine mystery when the institutional structures that produce and evaluate knowledge are not organized to accommodate the question. A Pictish symbol decipherment is not the kind of problem that a university archaeology department has the structure to attack. It requires a combination of linguistic, mathematical, and archaeological expertise that is rarely found in one person or one department. It requires access to a comprehensive database of all known symbol occurrences. It requires sustained attention over years or decades. And it requires a willingness to take seriously the possibility that the symbols encode something specific and decodable, which the mainstream of the field has not consistently maintained. The Linear B script of the Mycenaean Greeks was undeciphered for decades, and it was decoded in 1952 by Michael Ventris, an architect with no academic position in ancient languages, working from the same kind of careful quantitative analysis of symbol combinations that characterized the amateur Pictish researcher's approach. The story of how Ventris's decipherment was received with a mixture of astonishment and resistance is instructive. He was right, and he was an outsider. The Pictish symbols are harder than Linear B because we do not have the same kind of rich corpus of texts, and we have not yet identified any bilingual inscription that might serve as a key. But the possibility that they can eventually be read by someone with the right combination of skills and persistence and access to comprehensive data has not been ruled out. If they can be read, everything about the early medieval Pictish world will change. We will be able to read the stones, understand the symbols, access the voices of the people who made them. The sealed language will be opened, and then perhaps the objects in the 1774 mound will make a different kind of sense. Not just anomalies pointing in unknown directions, but pieces of a coherent picture that the decoded symbols can finally make readable. The night is getting late, or the early hours are settling in, depending on where you are and when you are listening. The story of the 1774 mound has taken us through 1,000 years, and across the North Atlantic, and into the deep questions of how knowledge is made and lost, and sometimes, slowly, recovered. Let me gather the threads one last time before we rest. The Picts were real. They were not legendary. They were not the creatures of romantic nationalism, not simply the painted savages of Roman imagination, not simply the mysterious makers of undeciphered symbols. They were a people, complex and capable, who built a sophisticated culture in the far north of Britain, who maintained it in the face of Roman pressure, and Anglian expansion, and Norse raiding, and who were eventually absorbed into the kingdom that became Scotland. Their symbols are their most visible legacy, and those symbols are still speaking in a language we cannot yet fully read. The 1774 mound was one chamber in their landscape, one sealed deposit of meaning, placed in the earth with care and intention, maintained in community memory for centuries, opened too early for anyone to study it properly. The objects inside pointed toward connections that were unexpected, toward a world wider than the usual picture of early medieval Pictland, toward directions that the standard accounts of the period do not fully accommodate. The North Atlantic was not a barrier. It was a route. People crossed it before Columbus, in both directions, with more regularity and with more cultural consequence than the simplified historical narratives have allowed. The Irish monks were in Iceland, the Norse were in Newfoundland. What else was crossing, in those centuries of early medieval Atlantic navigation, is a question that is still being answered by new evidence and new methods. The pre-Columbian Americas were not isolated. They were home to sophisticated cultures with their own connections and trade networks extending across a continent. The peoples of the Atlantic coast of North America had been living in their landscape for thousands of years before any European documentary record of them began, And the oral traditions they maintained carry a different kind of history that has not been fully integrated into the accounts of what was possible and what happened before 1492. These are all large stories. The 1,774 mound is a small story. But the small story opens onto the large ones in ways that are worth following, because the gaps in the large stories are sometimes filled by small ones that nobody thought to look at closely. The sealed chamber, the anomalous objects, the 18th century accounts that reached beyond their own categories of understanding, the warning that lasted 1,000 years and was then overridden by a practical farmer with a spade and an ordinary need to flatten his field, all of it pointing at something that has not yet been fully seen. All of it still, in some sense, sealed, even after the capstone was lifted in 1774. The Pictish symbols are patient, the questions are patient, and the northeast of Scotland is still there, still carrying its layers of the ancient world beneath the improved and re-improved surface of the agricultural present, still hiding in its sealed mounds and unexcavated fields the evidence that would answer the questions, if the right questions are asked in the right way, with the right tools. We are getting closer to having the right tools. The ancient DNA revolution, the chemical analysis revolution, the LiDAR revolution. These are all ways of asking the Earth to give up what it has been keeping, and the Earth is slowly, partially, answering. Somewhere in that process, the 1,774 mound will find its context. The anomalous metal plate, if it can ever be traced, will be chemically analyzed and placed in a production tradition. The ceramic will be sourced. The symbols will be read, the burial will be understood. That day may be closer than we think, or it may be further away than we hope. The historical record is not patient with our timelines. It yields at its own pace, on its own terms, often when nobody is specifically looking, in the accidental discoveries that have always driven the field forward. A farmer turning his field, an archaeologist following a fisherman's lead, a schoolteacher with a passion for carved stones, spending 2 decades building a database by hand. The mystery of the 1,774 mound is one thread in a larger tapestry. The tapestry is enormous and incompletely woven, and the threads go in directions that have not all been charted. But it is being woven, always, by the people who keep asking and keep looking, and refuse to let the questions close down into comfortable silence. The seal stain No was the sealed stone hill. The seal was broken in 1774. The stone is gone, levelled, returned to soil. But the questions that came out of the breaking are still moving. They are moving tonight, through this story, through your sleepy awareness of the words and the images they carry, through whatever part of your mind is still following the thread as you drift towards sleep. The makers of marks are patient, the symbols are patient, the northeast of Scotland is patient, and somewhere under that patient landscape there are more sealed chambers. We will find them, and when we do, we will be better prepared than the farmer was in 1774. We will have learned to ask the right questions. The sealed stone hill is teaching us still. Sleep well. Wherever you are listening from, the symbols are watching, the questions are alive. And the history that is still hidden is waiting with the particular patience of the very old and the very dark and the very deliberately sealed, until it is opened again, until we are ready, until we have finally learned enough to read what was always there, carved in stone, placed in earth, sealed from the world, waiting for the moment when the right combination of knowledge and tools and questions would finally let the meaning come through. That moment may be coming. It may already be here, in some laboratory or archive or field survey that will be reported in a paper next year or the year after, changing something we thought we knew and opening the next set of questions. The Picts are not done surprising us. They never were. Good night. The marks are still there. We will read them. One day, there is a concept in archaeology called the palimpsest, originally a term from manuscript studies, where it describes parchment that has been scraped clean and rewritten on. The palimpsest in archaeology refers to a landscape that has been used and reused by successive cultures, each one leaving traces on the same terrain, the traces overlapping and intersecting until the picture becomes enormously complex and requires careful analysis to separate the layers. The northeast of Scotland is one of the most densely palimpsested landscapes in the world. Every period of human activity from the Mesolithic onwards has left traces there. The hunter-gatherers of the period after the last ice age camped on the river banks and left their flint-knapping debris. The Neolithic farmers built their stone circles and their long cairns. The Bronze Age communities raised their round cairns and made their metal tools and left their traces in the soil. The Iron Age people built their hill forts and their souterrains. The Picts carved their symbols and built their chambers. The early medieval church built its monasteries. The Norse left their place names. The medieval farmers built their townships. The agricultural improvers of the 18th century ploughed and drained and levelled. The modern agricultural regime has continued the transformation, applying chemicals and machines and drainage systems that the 18th century improvers could not have imagined. Under all of this, the earlier layers persist. Not perfectly, not everywhere. They have been disturbed and damaged and partially destroyed by everything that came after. But they are there, in fragments, waiting for the combination of conditions that will make them visible again. The 1774 mound was one fragment of an earlier layer, made briefly visible by the accident of agricultural improvement, and then partly lost again before it could be properly studied. But it was not the only fragment. The northeastern Scottish landscape is full of fragments of the Pictish layer, most of them well understood within the limits of what we know about Pictish culture, a few of them anomalous in ways that point toward things we do not know. Reading the palimpsest is the work of archaeology and history. Layer by layer, fragment by fragment, building up a picture that is always incomplete but always growing. The picture of early medieval Scotland has grown enormously in the last generation. Ancient DNA studies have revealed population movements and genetic continuities that were not visible before. Chemical analysis of finds has traced the sources of materials and revealed trade connections that the objects themselves did not disclose. New excavations at key sites have produced evidence that revises what we thought we knew about how people lived and died and organized their communities. In this growing picture, the anomalies stand out more clearly. The things that do not fit the revised understanding are, paradoxically, more visible now than they were when the understanding was simpler. The 1774 mound, in the context of a richer picture of Pictish Scotland, becomes more interesting, not less. Its anomalies are harder to explain away precisely because the standard explanations have become more sophisticated. What cannot be explained by more sophisticated versions of the standard explanations is what the 1774 accounts suggest most clearly: that at least one of the objects in that chamber came from somewhere that has not yet been identified within the known sphere of early medieval contact and exchange, not simply a distant corner of the known world, somewhere beyond it. This is a strong claim based on weak evidence. The 18th century accounts are not the kind of source from which strong claims are usually made, but the weakness of the source does not make the claim impossible. It makes it unconfirmed. And unconfirmed is not the same as untrue. The mystery of the 1774 mound is not closed, it is open, and getting more open as the context in which it sits becomes better understood. One day it will be possible to say something more specific about it. For now, the most honest thing is to say that something was there, something unusual, and we do not know what it was or where it came from, and that not knowing is a reason to keep looking, not a reason to stop asking. The makers of marks left their marks. We are still learning to read them. The sealed stone hill held its secret as long as it could. The secret is out in the air now, moving through the world in the form of these questions, looking for the context that will finally give it a home in our understanding. The Picts would recognize this. They were a people who understood that meaning persists even when the immediate context for reading it has been lost. Their symbols are still there, on the stones, carrying their meaning through the centuries to eyes that cannot yet decode them. The meaning is patient. It waits. We should be as patient as the meaning, as patient as the stones, as patient as the sealed chamber that held its questions for 1,000 years, waiting for the moment when someone would be ready to ask them properly. That moment is now. It has been now for a while. And the questions are asking themselves, as they have been since 1774, in the particular voice of the mystery that knows its time is coming. Listen, the Picts are speaking, in the only language they left us, in the symbols and the silence and the sealed chambers and the long chain of wonder they set in motion with their art and their knowledge and their refusal to explain themselves to those who would come after. Listen, the answer is coming. It has been coming for 1,000 years. It will be worth waiting for. And tonight, as you drift towards sleep in whatever part of the world you are in, with this story settling into your dreaming mind and the questions taking root in whatever part of you holds the things that matter, know that you are part of the chain. Part of the long human inquiry that began when the farmer drove his spade into the seal-stained no and the first light touched the things that had been waiting in the dark. The light is still reaching, the inquiry is still moving. The Picts are still speaking, in their patient, unreadable way, to everyone willing to listen. You are listening, that is everything. Rest now, the symbols will be there in the morning, the questions will be there, the mystery will be there, and it will still be worth asking. Good night. There is one more layer to this story, and it sits beneath everything else we have discussed tonight. It is the layer of deep geological time, the layer that reminds us that the landscape of Aberdeenshire was shaped by forces so old and so vast that all of human history sits on its surface like a thin film of meaning. The hills that the farmer walked in 1774 were shaped by glaciation. The ice that covered Scotland during the last Great Ice Age, which ended roughly 12,000 years ago, ground the landscape down to bedrock in some places and deposited deep drifts of glacial material in others. The hills of the northeast are rounded because ice rounded them. The valleys are broad and U-shaped because glaciers carved them. The soil that the farmer was ploughing had been deposited by glacial outwash and then modified by 10,000 years of vegetation and human activity. The Picts, who built the sealed chamber, were farming this post-glacial landscape. The stones they used to build the chamber walls were almost certainly glacially deposited erratics, stones carried by ice from their original location and deposited when the ice melted, scattered across the landscape in the random way of glacial material. The Picts picked them up and fitted them together with skill, turning the random deposits of glacial time into the deliberate architecture of human time. This is what human beings do. We take the raw material that geological time has deposited around us and we shape it into meaning. We take stones and we build chambers. We take other stones and we carve symbols on them. We take metal from the earth and we work it into plates that carry figures. We take clay and we fire it into vessels that hold organic residues. We take all the physical material that the world has provided and we arrange it into patterns that mean something to us, that carry our intentions and our beliefs and our understanding of the world outward through time, past our own deaths, into a future we cannot see. The sealed chamber was an act of exactly this kind, a deliberate arrangement of material into a pattern of meaning, placed in the earth with the intention that it would persist, and it did persist. For 1,000 years it held its arrangement in the dark, waiting for the moment when it would be opened and its meaning would, perhaps, be decoded. The moment of opening came in 1774, and the decoding did not happen, not fully, not yet. But the intention behind the arrangement is still visible, even if the specific content of the meaning is not. The care of the stonework, the precision of the ceiling, the quality of the objects, whatever exactly they were. These all speak to an intention that was serious and considered, that treated the arrangement as something worth getting right. We are still trying to get it right, in our reading of what was there. We are still trying to honor the intention of the makers with the seriousness that the intention deserves. Not credulity, not wishful thinking, not the imposition of our own narratives onto their arrangement, but genuine inquiry, careful attention, the willingness to follow the anomalies where they lead, even when they lead somewhere uncomfortable. The geological time and the human time and the historical time all sit on top of each other in the northeast of Scotland, layer on layer, each one shaped by the forces that came before and shaping in turn the conditions for what comes after. The sealed chamber sat at the intersection of all of these times, built in human time, using material provided by geological time, surviving into the historical time that began to record things in writing. And then it was opened, and the questions came out, and they have been in the historical time ever since, being carried forward by the writing that the 18th century observers left behind, the partial and imperfect writing that is all we have. The writing is enough. It is enough to know that something was there, something unusual, something that pointed in directions that the standard accounts of the period did not fully accommodate. It is enough to keep the inquiry going. It is enough to bring us here, tonight, following the thread of the mystery through the dark. That is what stories are for. They carry the things that the material record cannot fully carry. The atmosphere of a discovery, the texture of an encounter with the past, the sense of what it felt like to stand at the edge of something you could not quite understand. The minister's letter carries something of what it felt like to hear the farmer's account and to look at the objects that had come out of the darkness. Cordner's account carries something of what it felt like to look at a metal plate that would not fit any tradition he knew and to search for words to describe the experience of that not fitting. These are human responses to genuine mystery. They are imperfect and partial and filtered through the particular frames of their time and place. But they are real. They happened. Someone felt the gap between what they were seeing and what their categories could accommodate, and they tried to write that gap down. That effort of writing, of trying to record the thing that could not quite be categorized, is itself part of the story. It is part of what makes the 1774 mound a mystery rather than simply a lost archaeological context. The mystery was created not just by the objects but by the people who tried to record them and found that their categories were insufficient. And now you are part of the mystery too. By listening to this story, by following these threads through the night, you have brought the questions of the 1774 mound into your own awareness, your own time, your own place in the world. The questions are now in Iloilo and London and Tokyo and California and wherever else you are listening from. They have travelled from Aberdeenshire in 1774 through the chain of partial accounts and the accumulated inquiry of historians and archaeologists and the reaching curiosity of people who love this kind of story. The sealed stone hill is everywhere now. Its questions are in the air. And wherever you are, and whatever time it is, you are holding a small piece of a mystery that has been travelling through the world for 2.5 centuries, looking for the context that will finally let it rest. Rest yourself. The questions will be there in the morning. They have been there every morning for 250 years. They can wait one more night. Sleep well. The Picts are patient, and so are we. In the end, every great mystery is really a story about attention, about what we choose to look at and what we choose to look past, about which anomalies we treat as data and which we dismiss as noise. The 1774 mound was looked at, briefly, inadequately, by people who did not have the tools to understand what they were seeing. Then it was looked past, for 2 centuries, by a field that had other priorities. And now we are looking at it again, with different tools and different questions and a different sense of what might be worth knowing. What we will eventually see, when the looking is finally thorough enough, is something we cannot predict. It might confirm the most conservative interpretation, an unusual but explainable Pictish burial with objects from within the known sphere of early medieval exchange. It might confirm something more radical, evidence of connections that extend the known sphere of Pictish contact in unexpected directions. It might reveal something that nobody has yet imagined, something that requires a different framework entirely to make sense of. That is what genuine inquiry does. It opens space for answers that the questions themselves did not anticipate. The history of knowledge is full of moments where the attempt to answer a specific question led somewhere that transformed the entire landscape of what was known. The 1774 mound, humble and poorly documented as it is, might be the kind of question that leads somewhere unexpected. Or it might not. The anomalous objects might eventually be explained in ways that are entirely consistent with the standard picture. The mystery might resolve into something less mysterious. That is also possible, and it is part of what makes genuine inquiry genuine, the willingness to let the answer be whatever it is, not what you hoped it would be. The Picts did not leave us their preferences about how we should read their legacy. They left us the stones and the silver and the sealed chambers and the symbols, and they let us make of them what we could. We have made a good deal, and there is still more to make. The inquiry is not finished. The palimpsest is not fully read, but tonight is finished, or the early hours of it are settling into the particular stillness that precedes sleep. The story has gone as far as it can go for now, and the questions are settling into the quiet corners of your mind where they will sit until you are ready to ask them again. The farmer broke the seal in 1774. We are still reading what came out. We will keep reading, as long as the questions keep being worth asking. They are worth asking. They will always be worth asking. Good night.